Welcome, dear listener. Welcome to another journey through the less celebrated corners of history. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight, or perhaps it's morning where you are, or a lazy afternoon. Wherever you find yourself in this wide world, whatever time has brought you to this moment, you are most welcome here. Before we begin our tale tonight, if you enjoy these deep dives into history's darker corners, these long-form explorations designed to let your mind wander while your body rests, please consider subscribing. It helps more people find these stories, these boring histories, these gentle descents into sleep. But there's no pressure, of course. You're here now, and that's what matters. Tonight, we're travelling north, far north, to a place where winter wasn't simply a season, but a test of endurance, a crucible that separated the living from the dead with ruthless efficiency. We're journeying to the world of the Norse people, those we've come to call Vikings, during the long, dark months that defined their existence. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Vikings. We've all heard the stories, haven't we? The raiders, the warriors, the dragon ships cutting through fog-shrouded seas, the berserkers and the shield maidens and all those dramatic tales of conquest and glory. But tonight, we're not interested in the drama. We're interested in something far more fundamental, far more universal, and in its own way far more terrifying than any battlefield. We're interested in winter. Picture, if you will, a world where the sun disappears for months at a time, where temperatures plunge so low that exhaled breath becomes ice crystals before reaching the ground, where a single mistake, a wet boot, a poorly maintained fire, a misjudged food supply, could mean death not just for you, but for everyone who depended on you. Imagine darkness so complete and so prolonged that it became a physical presence, a weight pressing down on the human spirit with relentless pressure. This is where we're going tonight, into the longhouses and the frozen fields, into the minds of people who understood with absolute clarity that winter was an enemy far more implacable than any human foe. So settle in, get comfortable, let the modern world fade away as we step back more than 1,000 years to a time and place where survival itself was an achievement worth celebrating. Are you ready? Then let us begin. To understand the brutal reality of Viking winters, we must first understand where and when these people lived. We're speaking primarily of Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden and Denmark, during the period historians call the Viking Age, roughly from 793 CE to 1066 CE. But our focus extends somewhat earlier and later, because winter, after all, doesn't respect the neat boundaries historians draw. The geography of Scandinavia during this period was both blessing and curse. Much of Norway consists of mountains and narrow coastal valleys, with settlements clustered wherever arable land could be found. Sweden offered more extensive farmland, particularly in the central regions, but stretched far enough north that portions spent months in polar darkness. Denmark, the most temperate of the three, still experienced winters that would shock most modern people. These lands sit between latitudes 55 and 71 degrees north. For comparison, the southern tip of Denmark is roughly level with Moscow, while northern Norway extends far beyond the Arctic Circle. The warming influence of the Gulf Stream made, and makes, parts of coastal Norway surprisingly mild compared to other regions at similar latitudes. But mild is a relative term. Winter was still winter. The climate during the Viking Age was slightly warmer than the centuries that preceded and followed it. This period, sometimes called the medieval warm period, allowed Norse expansion to places like Iceland, Greenland, and briefly, North America. But warmer again is relative. We're comparing viciously cold to absolutely frigid. The Norse who settled these regions were moving into environments where winter survival required every ounce of knowledge, preparation, and communal effort their culture could muster. Population density was low by modern standards. Estimates suggest perhaps 1 to 2 million people across all of Scandinavia during this period. Small farming communities dotted the landscape, connected by rough paths and seasonal sea routes. Each community was largely self-sufficient because it had to be. When winter closed in, you survived on what you had prepared, what you had stored, what you had built. There was no supply chain to rely upon, no grocery store to visit, no cavalry riding to your rescue. The landscape itself was treacherous. Forests of pine, spruce and birch covered much of the region, their branches heavy with snow for half the year. Bogs and marshes became frozen death traps. Fjords and inlets froze solid enough to walk on, which was both opportunity and danger. Ice could break without warning, and falling through meant almost certain death. Mountains rose harsh and unforgiving, their slopes avalanche-prone, their passes blocked by snow for months at a stretch. This was the stage upon which our story unfolds, a stage set far north, in an age before modern heating or food preservation or weather forecasting. A stage where winter arrived like an invading army and held the land under siege until spring, if spring came at all. The Norse people who inhabited this harsh environment were not primitive or backward, as popular culture sometimes suggests. They were sophisticated farmers, skilled craftspeople, ingenious boat builders, and remarkably adaptable survivors. Their culture had evolved specifically to meet the challenges of their environment, and winter survival was woven into every aspect of their society. Agriculture formed the foundation of Norse life, but it was agriculture practiced at the very edge of viability. The growing season was short, sometimes as brief as 3 months in northern regions. This meant that every aspect of farming had to be precisely timed and executed, with skill born of generations of hard-won experience. Barley, oats and rye were the primary crops, along with vegetables like cabbages, onions and peas. Livestock included cattle, sheep, goats, pigs and chickens, all of which needed to be fed through the winter months. The social structure of Norse society was intimately connected to winter survival. At the bottom were thralls, slaves, often captured in raids, who performed the hardest labour. Above them were free farmers, who worked their own land and had rights within the community. At the top were jarls and kings, the wealthy elite who controlled more land and resources. But here's the crucial point. Everyone, regardless of status, faced winter's threat. A jarl might have more supplies, a larger hall, more thralls to maintain the fire and prepare food. But if winter was harsh enough, if supplies ran short, if disease struck, wealth offered only a marginal advantage. Winter was the great equalizer. Norse religion, that complex web of beliefs we now call Norse paganism or Norse mythology, was deeply concerned with cosmic cycles of destruction and renewal. The concept of Fimbul winter, the terrible winter that would precede Ragnarok, the end of the world, wasn't just mythology. It was prophecy rooted in observed reality. The Norse had lived through winters so severe they must have seemed apocalyptic. They had seen years when spring came late or barely came at all, when harvests failed, when communities starved. The myth of Fimbul winter, 3 winters with no summers in between, where wolves devoured the sun and moon, where brother fought brother for scraps of food, this wasn't fantasy. This was memory. The Vikings' famous raids and explorations were partly about wealth and glory, yes, but also about survival. Trading, raiding, and settling new lands were strategies for managing population pressure and resource scarcity. When a farm could only support so many people, younger sons had to seek their fortune elsewhere. When winter food stores were inadequate, summer raiding could make the difference between survival and starvation. The Viking Age itself was, in part, an adaptation to the challenges of northern living. Here, then, is what we'll explore over the next hours together. We're going to examine the brutal reality of Viking winters, not through the lens of glory or adventure, but through the lens of daily survival. We're going to look at how darkness, cold and isolation affected both body and mind. We're going to explore the ingenious adaptations the Norse developed, and we're going to unflinch from the harsh truths, the hunger, the disease, the violence, the death. This is boring history in our particular sense. Not boring because it's dull, quite the opposite. Boring because we're drilling down, deep and slow, into the mundane details that made life possible. The structure of a longhouse, the process of preserving meat, the mathematics of food storage, the psychology of darkness, the rituals that held communities together when the world itself seemed intent on tearing them apart. We'll move through 25 chapters, each exploring a different facet of this winter world. We'll start with the physical environment and living conditions, then move through daily routines, food and survival, the psychological toll, death and disease, social structures under stress, and finally the worst of the worst. Those winters that became legend because they pushed human endurance past all reasonable limits. This won't be a cheerful journey, dear listener, but it will be a fascinating one, and perhaps, from the comfort of your warm bed or cosy couch, with central heating and a refrigerator full of food, you'll develop a new appreciation for just how extraordinary these ordinary people were. How their daily survival was a kind of heroism we rarely acknowledge, because it wasn't performed on a battlefield or commemorated in stone. So let us begin with the most basic question of all. Where did Vikings live during the winter? The answer is more complex and more claustrophobic than you might imagine. Let us start with shelter, that most fundamental of human needs. The Norse longhouse was both sanctuary and prison, the single structure upon which winter survival depended absolutely. Understanding the longhouse is understanding everything that follows, because for roughly 6 months of every year, this building was the entire world. Picture, if you will, a structure 30 to 60 feet long and 15 to 20 feet wide. The walls are thick timber planks or wattle and daub, chinked with moss and clay to seal every gap against the wind. The roof is turf, thick slabs of earth and grass laid over wooden boards, heavy enough to resist the strongest gales and insulated enough to trap precious heat inside. There are few windows, perhaps none at all in northern regions. The doorways are low and narrow, hung with thick hides or wooden doors that seal tight. This is intentional. Every opening is a place where heat escapes and cold enters. Inside, the air is thick and grey with smoke. The central fire pit, running perhaps 20 feet down the middle of the hall, is the heart of everything. It's never allowed to go completely out during winter, because restarting a fire from scratch requires tools and materials that might not be accessible, and because the time it takes for the hall to chill completely can lead to frozen food stores and frozen people. The smoke from this fire is supposed to exit through a hole in the roof, but in practice much of it hangs in the upper reaches of the hall, an acrid fog that stings the eyes and coats the lungs. The darkness inside a longhouse during winter is difficult for modern people to comprehend. On an overcast day, or after sunset, the only light comes from the fire and perhaps a few oil lamps, precious resources carefully rationed. The flickering firelight creates a world of shadows, where the walls seem to move and the corners hold impenetrable darkness. This is where you live. This is where you eat, sleep, work and exist for months at a time. But the truly brutal aspect of the longhouse in winter is the crowding. This wasn't a single family home. A longhouse might shelter 20, 30, even 40 people. Extended family, thralls, perhaps guests or allies who needed winter shelter. And not just people. In the coldest regions, livestock were brought inside too. Goats, sheep, sometimes even cattle penned at the far end of the hall. Their body heat helped warm the building, yes, but their presence added to the already overwhelming mix of smells, sounds and sheer press of living bodies. You slept on raised platforms along the walls, perhaps on a thin mattress of straw and hides, huddled under wool blankets and furs. Privacy didn't exist. You heard every cough, every snore, every intimate conversation, every bodily function of dozens of people. You smelled the unwashed bodies, the animals, the smoke, the food, the waste. In the worst of winter, you might not leave this structure for days or even weeks at a time. It's hard not to think of the longhouse as a kind of pressure cooker, a confined space where tensions inevitably built, where tempers frayed, where the human need for space and solitude went unmet for months on end. So the next time you feel crowded sharing a house with a few family members, remember they were enduring something far more extreme, and they had to do it every single winter of their lives. But the structure itself was only the beginning. Let's talk about what happened when that structure wasn't quite good enough to keep the cold at bay. Temperature is just a number until you've experienced true cold, not the kind where you shiver and put on another sweater, the kind where your body begins to shut down, where thought itself becomes difficult, where death is a measurable, inevitable process unless you find warmth immediately. Imagine a January night in northern Norway, perhaps in the year 950. Outside, the temperature has dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 Fahrenheit. The wind is howling at 30 miles per hour, driving the wind chill even lower. In these conditions, exposed skin freezes in less than 5 minutes. An unprotected human being, even a strong adult in good health, would be dead in perhaps 20 minutes. This is the world just beyond the walls of the longhouse. Inside, if you're fortunate, if the fire is well maintained and the building well sealed, the temperature near the fire might reach 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, 60 to 68 Fahrenheit. Tolerably warm, especially if you're wearing wool and sitting near the flames. But move 10 feet away from the fire toward the walls, where the sleeping platforms are, and the temperature drops dramatically. 5 degrees, even below freezing in poorly constructed buildings or during the worst weather. You sleep cold, you wake cold. You're never, truly, comfortably warm except for brief moments close to the fire. The physical experience of chronic cold is insidious. Your body burns calories at an accelerated rate just trying to maintain core temperature. You're hungry all the time, but food is rationed because supplies must last until spring. Your extremities are perpetually cold, numb fingers and toes that ache when you try to warm them. Your joints stiffen, your muscles cramp. Sleep becomes fitful because shivering wakes you, because you can't get comfortable, because your body is in a constant state of low-level stress. What made this truly brutal was the relentlessness. 1 cold night is unpleasant. 2 weeks of cold nights is exhausting. 4 months, 5 months, 6 months of never being warm except for brief intervals is a form of torture that grinds down the spirit as much as the body. The cold became a constant companion, a malevolent presence that couldn't be escaped, only endured. And then there was frostbite. The Norse knew it well. Frozen fingers and toes that first went white, then mottled red and purple, then black as the tissue died. Minor frostbite meant pain and lost sensation. Severe frostbite meant amputation, or, if infection set in, death. And in a society where physical labour was essential to survival, losing fingers or toes could mean losing your ability to contribute, to work, to justify your consumption of precious resources. Children suffered particularly. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster, and they lacked the mass of fat and muscle that helped adults retain warmth. Infants were at constant risk. Parents slept with babies pressed against their bodies, using their own heat to keep the child alive through the night. Despite these precautions, infant mortality spiked in winter. Many babies simply didn't make it to spring. We can scarcely imagine what it was like to live in a state of perpetual cold for half of every year. To know that warmth was a luxury, carefully rationed. To understand that if the fire went out, if the wood supply ran short, if your clothing got wet, you were facing a potentially fatal situation. This wasn't discomfort. This was survival on a knife's edge, where the margin between life and death was measured in degrees of temperature and minutes of exposure. Yet even this cold was something the Norse learned to manage, to survive. But cold alone wasn't the only enemy. Closely related to it, equally dangerous, was the darkness. Darkness, like cold, is something modern people rarely experience in its true, unmitigated form. We have electric lights at the flick of a switch, street lamps that banish the night, screens that glow in the dark. For the Norse, especially those living in northern latitudes, winter darkness was a physical presence, an oppressive force that profoundly affected both body and mind. Consider the mathematics of daylight at different latitudes during winter. In southern Norway, around the winter solstice, you might have 6 to 7 hours of daylight. Dim, weak daylight, but light nonetheless. In central Scandinavia, that drops to 5 or 6 hours. In northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle, the sun doesn't rise at all for weeks or months, depending on how far north you are. This is the polar night, when the sun dips below the horizon in November and doesn't reappear until January or even February. But even the word darkness doesn't quite capture it. On a clear night with a full moon and snow on the ground, there was enough reflected light to see shapes to navigate. These were the better nights. On overcast nights, when clouds obscured moon and stars, when new snow hadn't fallen to brighten the landscape, the darkness was absolute. Step outside the longhouse, away from its firelight, and you literally could not see your hand in front of your face. Inside the longhouse, as we've discussed, light was precious and carefully rationed. A fire provided light, yes, but inconsistent light, flickering, shadowy, creating as many dark spaces as illuminated ones. Oil lamps, burning fish oil or animal fat were luxuries. The oil had to be stored for winter use, and every lamp lit was oil that couldn't be used for something else, for waterproofing leather or preserving wood or cooking, so lamps were used sparingly, if at all. What made this truly disturbing was the effect on human psychology. Humans are diurnal creatures. We're biologically programmed to be active during daylight hours and to sleep when it's dark. Our circadian rhythms, our sleep-wake cycles, our hormone production, all of it is tied to the light-dark cycle. Disrupt that cycle, and you disrupt the human organism in fundamental ways. The Norse didn't have a name for what we now call seasonal affective disorder, but they absolutely experienced it. Depression, lethargy, irritability, anxiety. These were common winter afflictions. The perpetual darkness affected mood and motivation. It made it difficult to tell time, to maintain routines, to feel connected to the normal rhythms of life. Days blurred together in an endless grey haze. The world shrank to the firelit interior of the longhouse, and even that small world seemed darker, heavier, more oppressive as the weeks dragged on. Sleep patterns deteriorated. Some people slept too much, retreating into unconsciousness as an escape from the monotony and darkness. Others suffered from insomnia, lying awake in the dark for hours, their minds churning through worries and fears, unable to rest even though their bodies were exhausted. The quality of sleep declined. Dreams became vivid and disturbing. People woke unrefreshed, facing another day, or was it night, in the dim, smoky hall. And there was a spiritual component too. The Norse believed that winter was when the barrier between worlds was thinnest, when spirits and monsters roamed more freely. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence, something that could harbour malevolent forces. The long winter nights were when ghost stories were told, when protective rituals were performed, when people huddled close to the fire not just for warmth, but for the psychological comfort of light in the darkness. This reminds us that human beings need light almost as much as we need food and water and warmth. The Norse survived the darkness as they survived the cold through communal effort and hard-won adaptations. But survival came at a cost, paid in mental health and emotional well-being, in a pervasive sense of oppression that lifted only when the sun finally mercifully returned. Yet even with shelter from the cold and firelight against the darkness, there remained another fundamental challenge. People had to eat, and that brings us to the brutal calculus of winter food supply. Food storage in a pre-industrial society wasn't just important, it was the difference between life and death for an entire community. The Norse understood this with brutal clarity. From the moment the last harvest came in during autumn, a countdown began. The supplies had to last until spring, until new grass grew for the livestock, until fishing became productive again, until the first early crops could be harvested. This was typically 6 to 7 months, sometimes longer. Picture, if you will, a Norse householder standing in his storeroom in late October, looking at the supplies laid in for winter. Barrels of dried fish, smoked and salted to prevent rot. Sides of meat similarly preserved. Wheels of cheese. Jars of butter sealed with wax. Sacks of grain. Barley, oats, perhaps some rye. Root vegetables in pits lined with straw. And he's doing mathematics in his head. Mathematics that his life and the lives of everyone dependent on him require him to get exactly right. He's counting people. Family members, thralls, perhaps some hired workers who'll shelter with them through winter. Let's say 20 mouths to feed. He's counting animals that need to be fed. The breeding stock that must survive until spring. Because without them there's no herd next year. He's counting days, and he's calculating consumption rates, trying to balance adequate nutrition against the need to make supplies last. The brutal reality was that the calculation often didn't work out. You could do everything right, have a good harvest, store food properly, manage consumption carefully, and still run short if winter lasted longer than expected, if an unusually harsh cold snap killed stored crops, if disease struck the livestock, if mice got into the grain stores. The margin for error was razor thin to non-existent. What made this truly brutal was that the shortages didn't announce themselves suddenly. They crept in gradually over weeks and months. First, the portions got smaller. Then, the diet became more monotonous as variety was sacrificed to make staples last longer. Then, the staples themselves began to run low. By late winter, many Norse families were eating perhaps one small meal a day, supplemented by whatever could be scavenged or hunted despite the difficulty of winter hunting. Chronic malnutrition has effects beyond simple hunger. Your body begins to break down its own muscle tissue for energy. Your immune system weakens, making you vulnerable to disease. Your thinking becomes foggy, your reactions slow. Children stop growing. Pregnant women miscarry or give birth to underweight babies who often don't survive. The elderly and the weak succumb first, but starvation was an equal opportunity killer if it went on long enough. And here's where Norse society's hierarchical structure became starkest. The wealthy had more food, they ate better, ate more, had reserves they could dip into when others were starving. Thralls at the bottom of the social ladder were fed last and least. In truly desperate situations, they might not be fed at all. After all, they could be replaced more easily than family members. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake, or not entirely. This was cold calculation in a world where there literally wasn't enough food to go around. Some families made terrible decisions, sent weaker members out into the cold with a small bundle of food, ostensibly to reduce the burden on the household, but really as a kind of quiet execution. Exposed infants who were born at the wrong time, who would have consumed too much of a mother's calories during the hardest months. These weren't evil people, they were desperate people, making choices that haunt us precisely because we understand the logic, the terrible arithmetic that made such choices seem rational. So the next time you look in your refrigerator and see it well stocked with food, remember this. The Norse spent every winter engaged in a slow-motion race against starvation, and they didn't always win. But the hunger was only part of the problem. Let's talk about what they were actually eating, and how that affected their health. The Norse diet during summer and autumn could be quite varied and nutritious. Fresh meat, fish, vegetables, dairy products, berries, nuts, even some fruit in southern regions. But winter was a different matter entirely. The winter diet was monotonous, increasingly inadequate, and often frankly disgusting by the standards of people who had little choice but to eat it. Imagine breakfast on a cold morning in February. You wake on your sleeping platform, your breath visible in the air, your body stiff and hungry. You make your way to the fire, where a pot of porridge is simmering. But this isn't oatmeal as you know it. It's a thin gruel made from whatever grain is left, supplemented perhaps with some peas or beans. If you're fortunate, there's a dollop of butter or a piece of cheese to add flavour and fat. If you're not, it's just grain and water, and it tastes like wet flour because essentially that's what it is. For the main meal of the day, sometime in the afternoon when light and temperature are at their peak, there's dried fish. Not nicely prepared fish fillets. Dried fish that's been hanging in the storehouse for months, hard as wood, salty as the sea it came from. You have to pound it with rocks to break it down enough to eat. You soak it in water to remove some of the salt and soften it, but it still tastes overwhelmingly of salt and fish oil gone slightly rancid. And you eat this day after day, week after week, because fish was the most reliable winter protein source, the food that could be caught in vast quantities during summer and preserved for winter consumption. Then there's the meat, what little of it remains by midwinter. Butchering happened in autumn. Any animals that couldn't be fed through winter were slaughtered then, and the meat was smoked and salted. But preserved meat, like preserved fish, was not the delicacy you might imagine. It was dry, tough, sometimes borderline rotten despite preservation efforts. The salt used for preservation was not the refined table salt we know. It was coarse, sometimes contaminated with minerals that added unpleasant flavours. The smoking process helped, but smoke doesn't prevent decay indefinitely. What made this truly disturbing was what happened when food started to actually spoil. The Norse didn't have the luxury of throwing away questionable food. If the meat had developed a green tinge or an off-smell, you scraped away the worst of it and ate the rest. If the butter had gone rancid, making your stomach turn with its sharp chemical taste, you still ate it, because fat was calories and calories were survival. If weevils had gotten into the grain, you didn't pick them all out. You ate them too, extra protein. And then there were the desperate measures. Boiling leather scraps to make a kind of gelatinous soup that had no nutritional value but filled the stomach. Grinding up bark from certain trees to add bulk to bread, even though the human digestive system can't really process tree bark. Eating lichens scraped from rocks, which could cause stomach upset but was better than nothing. In the worst winters, there are accounts of people eating things we'd consider categorically inedible. Shoe leather, the thatch from roofs, even in the most extreme and horrible cases each other. The vitamin deficiency was severe by late winter. No fresh vegetables, no fresh fruit, little variety. Scurvy was common, bleeding gums, loose teeth, bone pain, exhaustion. Night blindness from lack of vitamin A. Digestive issues from the monotonous, poorly balanced diet. By the time spring arrived, many Norse people were in poor health, even if they'd managed to avoid outright starvation. Children suffered particularly from the poor diet. Growth stunting was common in Norse societies. Skeletal remains show evidence of periods of malnutrition during childhood, visible as lines in the bones where growth stopped temporarily. Pregnant and nursing women were in a terrible position, needing extra calories precisely when food was most scarce. We can scarcely imagine eating the same limited, poorly preserved foods for months on end, knowing that running out meant death, that every meal was one meal closer to the bottom of the barrel. The Norse did this every winter of their lives. It's a kind of endurance we rarely acknowledge, but it shaped them profoundly. Their culture, their values, their understanding of what life demanded from them. But even as they struggled with hunger and inadequate food, there was another daily challenge that consumed hours of backbreaking labour. Let's talk about water. Water seems simple. Turn on a tap, and there it is, clean and drinkable. But for the Norse in winter, water was a constant challenge that required daily effort and carried genuine risks. Understanding their relationship with water reveals just how much labour went into simply staying alive. Consider the problem. You need water for drinking, for cooking, for basic hygiene, such as it was, For the livestock, a community of 20 people might need 50 to 100 gallons of water per day. In summer, this comes from wells, springs, streams, or rivers. But in winter, in much of Scandinavia, water sources freeze solid. Picture, if you will, a cold morning in January. Someone, usually a thrall or a younger member of the household, has to go outside into the brutal cold and obtain water. If you're fortunate enough to have a well that hasn't frozen completely, you still have to chip through a layer of ice that might be several inches thick, reformed overnight. You hammer away with an iron pick or an axe, your hands going numb despite thick mittens, your breath coming in great white clouds. Finally, you break through and can lower a bucket into the water below. The bucket itself might have ice in it from yesterday. The rope is stiff with frost. The water you draw is just barely liquid, so cold it makes your teeth ache to drink it. But many wells did freeze completely, especially during the coldest months. Then the only option was to collect snow or chip ice from the nearest frozen stream or pond. Snow, however, is mostly air. It takes roughly 10 to 15 gallons of snow to produce 1 gallon of water when melted. So you're trudging back and forth with baskets or sacks, gathering enough snow to meet the day's needs. And all of that snow has to be melted, which requires fire, which requires precious fuel. The ice from streams and ponds had to be carried back, often substantial blocks of it, heavy and awkward and dangerously cold to handle. You'd stack it near the fire inside the longhouse to melt, but this was a slow process, and the meltwater from stream ice was often contaminated, clouded with sediment, possibly contaminated with animal waste or decaying organic matter that had been frozen into the ice. The Norse didn't understand germ theory, but they understood that some water made you sick. They learned to boil questionable water, another task that consumed time and fuel. What made this truly brutal was the daily, relentless nature of the task. Water procurement couldn't be skipped. You needed it every single day, regardless of weather, regardless of how cold it was, or how brutal the wind, or how exhausted everyone was, and it was genuinely dangerous work. Walking on frozen streams to chip ice could end with falling through and drowning, or at minimum getting soaked in water so cold it could induce cardiac arrest. The trips back and forth through snow and ice led to injuries, twisted ankles, falls, frostbite, and here's a dark aspect: water as a weapon of control. Thralls, who did much of this labour, were kept in line partly through the control of basic resources. Deny a thrall adequate water, and they weakened, became compliant. It wasn't often done, a weak thrall was less useful, but the possibility was always there, an implicit threat. The psychological weight of this daily necessity also ground people down. You could never simply relax by the fire and forget about survival tasks. Every day brought a new list of essential chores, and water was at the top of that list. The knowledge that if everyone simply gave up, if everyone decided they were too tired or too cold or too depressed to go out and get water, the household would be dead in days. This knowledge created a kind of grim determination, but also a bone-deep exhaustion. It's hard not to think about water differently when you understand what it costs to obtain it. So the next time you casually fill a glass from the tap, you might spare a thought for the Norse thrall standing in the pre-dawn darkness, hammering at frozen ice, doing the unglamorous work of survival that we've outsourced so thoroughly we forget it was ever necessary. But water was only one of many daily tasks that kept a Norse household functioning through winter. The real centrepiece of winter life was the fire, and maintaining it was its own form of tyranny. The fire in the centre of the longhouse was, quite literally, the difference between life and death. It provided warmth, light, the ability to cook food and melt water, and psychological comfort in the darkness and cold. But fire is a hungry thing. It consumes fuel constantly, and in winter, providing that fuel was a monumental task that shaped daily life. Imagine the mathematics of fuel consumption. A large fire, the kind needed to heat a longhouse housing 20 or 30 people, might burn through 50 to 100 pounds of wood per day. possibly more during the coldest weather. Over a 6-month winter, that's 9 to 18,000 pounds of wood. That's 4.5 to 9 tons of wood, and every bit of it had to be gathered, cut, split, and stored before winter arrived. The work began in summer. Men and older boys would venture into the forest with axes, felling trees, not the largest, oldest trees which were too hard to work, but medium-sized trees that could be handled with the tools available. The trees were cut into manageable lengths, then dragged or carried back to the settlement. This was back-breaking labour, day after day, week after week. You couldn't slack off, couldn't decide you'd gathered enough. You gathered as much as physically possible, because there was no such thing as too much firewood. The wood then had to be split. This required skill and strength, driving iron wedges into the wood, cleaving it into pieces small enough to burn efficiently. And here's where careful planning mattered. Wood had to be split and stacked to dry for months before it would burn well. Green wood, freshly cut, contains too much moisture. It produces more smoke than heat, and smoke without adequate heat was almost worse than no fire at all. It filled the longhouse without providing warmth. By autumn, you'd have great stacks of split wood, stored under shelter to keep it dry. But even then, the work wasn't finished. Throughout winter, someone had to maintain the fire. This was often the work of thralls or the elderly, people who stayed inside while others did work outside. The fire tender's job was to feed the fire regularly, to keep it burning at the right intensity, hot enough to provide warmth and allow cooking, but not so hot that it consumed wood wastefully. What made this truly exhausting was that the fire couldn't be allowed to go out. Restarting a fire from scratch with the tools available, flint and steel or a bow drill, was difficult, time-consuming work, especially when you're cold and your hands don't work well. Moreover, if the fire went out and the longhouse chilled completely, it could take days to warm it back up to livable temperatures. So the fire burned day and night, month after month, an endless mouth that had to be fed. And feeding it was harder than it sounds. The wood was stored outside, or in an attached shed, to prevent filling the living space with even more combustible material. So someone had to go outside periodically, brave the cold and wind, load up with logs, and bring them inside. The logs brought with them snow and ice that had to melt off, creating puddles and adding to the dampness inside. The constant opening of doors to bring in wood let cold air in, making the fire work harder, consuming more wood, requiring more trips outside. The really dark aspect was what happened when wood supplies ran short. This happened more often than you might think. A longer than expected winter, wood that didn't dry properly and burned inefficiently, damage to the wood pile from weather or pests. When wood ran short, people started burning anything combustible. Furniture, if you had extra. Parts of the structure itself, ceiling boards, wall timbers, anything that could be spared, though this was a dangerous game that could compromise the building. In the worst cases, people froze to death in their homes, the fire dead. No fuel to revive it. No way to get warm enough to survive. There are accounts from particularly harsh winters of people dismantling empty buildings for fuel, of neighbouring farms raiding each other's woodpiles, of violence breaking out over access to forests that had already been stripped bare. The fire's hunger could drive people to desperate acts. We can scarcely imagine the constant pressure of maintaining a fire for 6 months straight, knowing that failure meant death. The Norse lived with this pressure every winter, and it shaped their culture in profound ways. Cooperation was essential because fire management was too demanding for any individual, but tensions ran high because everyone's survival depended on everyone else doing their part. Yet even with fire, water and food, there remained the problem of staying healthy in an environment that was hostile to human health in almost every way. Let's talk about what happened to Norse bodies during winter. Winter didn't just make life uncomfortable for the Norse, it actively attacked the human body in ways both obvious and insidious. Understanding the physical toll of a Viking winter means understanding that these people spent months in a state of chronic physiological stress. Picture your body in a Norse longhouse in February. You're cold, almost always. Your core temperature is maintained, barely, but your extremities are perpetually cold. This isn't just uncomfortable, it forces your cardiovascular system to work harder, constricting blood vessels in your fingers, toes, nose and ears to preserve warmth for your vital organs. Over time, this causes damage. Chilblains were endemic. Painful inflammation of the skin caused by repeated exposure to cold, leading to itching, swelling, sometimes blistering and infection. Your respiratory system is under constant assault. You're breathing air thick with smoke from the fire, and smoke is a toxic irritant containing particulate matter and chemicals like carbon monoxide. Chronic smoke exposure led to respiratory diseases, persistent coughs, difficulty breathing, increased susceptibility to pneumonia and tuberculosis. Excavated Norse skeletons show evidence of respiratory disease in their rib bones and sinuses. The darkness affected your body in measurable ways. Vitamin D, which humans produce when sunlight hits our skin, drops to near zero during the dark months. This leads to bone weakening, to depression and fatigue, to a weakened immune system. The Norse diet, as we've discussed, was deficient in many nutrients by late winter. The combination of nutritional deficiency and stress made people vulnerable to disease. What made this truly brutal was the lack of hygiene. Bathing was difficult in winter, it required heating large amounts of water, which required fuel, and the thought of getting naked in a cold building was unappealing at best. So people went weeks, sometimes months, without proper washing. Their clothing, made of wool and leather, absorbed sweat and body oils and couldn't be easily cleaned. The result was pervasive skin conditions, rashes, boils, infections. Lice were universal. Body lice, head lice, living in the seams of clothing and feeding on human blood. The Norse accepted lice as a fact of life, as inevitable as cold or darkness. And here's a particularly disturbing detail: dental health. The Norse diet wore down teeth. The bread often contained grit from stone grinding mills, and the constant consumption of dried fish and meat was abrasive. Tooth decay was common, and with decay came abscesses, pockets of infection in the jaw that caused excruciating pain. There was no real dental care. You suffered until the tooth fell out, or, in some cases, someone pulled it out with pliers or similar tools, without anaesthetic. Dental infections could and did kill when bacteria spread from the mouth to the bloodstream. The close quarters of the longhouse facilitated disease transmission. One person catches a cold, and soon everyone has it. Influenza could sweep through a longhouse in days, and what was a minor illness in summer could be deadly in winter when bodies were already weakened. Tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia. These were constant threats. Children's bodies bore particular scars. Skeletal evidence shows that Norse children experienced multiple episodes of severe illness or malnutrition, visible as Harris lines, horizontal lines in the bones where growth stopped temporarily. Many children had stunted growth, never reaching the height their genetics should have allowed. Infant mortality was astronomical by modern standards. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before age 5, and winter was when most of those deaths occurred. Women's bodies faced unique stresses. Pregnancy and childbirth in winter were especially dangerous. A pregnant woman needed extra calories precisely when food was scarcest. Childbirth in a cold, dark, smoke-filled longhouse, with limited assistance and no medical knowledge beyond traditional midwifery, carried substantial risks. Many women died in childbirth. Many more suffered permanent damage, prolapse, fistulas, chronic pain. The elderly, too, suffered disproportionately. When your body is already weakened by age, the additional stress of winter could be fatal. There's a reason that many elderly Norse people didn't survive winter. Their bodies simply couldn't endure one more season of cold, poor nutrition, and respiratory assault. This reminds us that Viking winters weren't just an inconvenience. but a months-long assault on human physiology. The Norse survived, but they paid a price in chronic poor health, in shortened lifespans, in bodies that bore the scars of winter long after the snow melted. And if physical health was difficult to maintain, mental health was perhaps even more precarious. Let's turn to that darker subject now. We've discussed the physical environment of Viking winter, but the psychological environment was equally brutal and perhaps less understood by the Norse themselves. Modern psychology recognises conditions like seasonal affective disorder, cabin fever, and trauma responses. The Norse had no such vocabulary, but they absolutely experienced the mental health consequences of their winter existence. Consider the psychological impact of spending months in a confined space with dozens of other people. Humans need privacy, quiet, personal space. These needs aren't luxuries, they're deeply wired into our psychology. Deprive someone of privacy for long enough, and mental health deteriorates. The Norse lived without privacy for 6 months at a stretch. You could never escape the noise, the constant presence of others, the feeling of being observed and crowded and pressed upon. Picture, if you will, lying on your sleeping platform at night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. Around you, 20 or 30 people are sleeping, snoring, coughing, shifting in their beds. The animals at the end of the hall are restless. The fire crackles and pops. Someone is having a whispered conversation. A baby is crying. The smell of unwashed bodies and animal waste is overwhelming. And you lie there, hour after hour, your mind churning, unable to find peace. The monotony was psychologically crushing. Day after day of the same limited activities, the same faces, the same conversations, the same view from the door when you ventured outside, snow and ice and grey sky, the same food, the same routine. Human brains crave novelty and stimulation. Deprive the brain of new inputs, and it begins to malfunction. Boredom becomes a physical discomfort, a kind of mental pain. What made this truly disturbing was the depression that settled over many people during winter. In the endless darkness, with limited light and poor nutrition and constant stress, brain chemistry changed. Serotonin and dopamine levels dropped. People became lethargic, unable to motivate themselves to do even necessary tasks. They experienced anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure or joy. Life became a grey slog, devoid of meaning or hope, and the only question was whether spring would come before the will to live gave out entirely. Anxiety was equally pervasive. The worry about food supplies, the fear of disease, the concern that the weather would worsen, that the winter would never end, that some disaster would strike that the community couldn't survive. This wasn't irrational anxiety. These were real, present dangers. But the psychological burden of constant worry, month after month, eroded mental health and resilience. Interpersonal conflicts intensified under these conditions. Small annoyances became major irritations. Old grievances were nursed and magnified. The lack of privacy meant that every conflict was public, witnessed by everyone, making it harder to let things go. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, someone sitting too close to the fire, someone eating more than their fair share, someone making too much noise. These arguments could escalate because there was no escape, no way to cool off and get perspective. And then there was violence. The Norse were not a pacifist people, and winter brought out the worst in terms of domestic violence and abuse. Men took out their frustrations on women, on children, on thralls. Women trapped in the longhouse with their abusers had no recourse and no escape. Children bore physical and psychological scars that would affect them for life, assuming they survived to adulthood. The sagas occasionally mention people going winter mad, developing what we might call psychosis, breaking from reality under the accumulated stress. They speak of people who became convinced that spirits, or monsters were in the hall with them. People who attacked family members in paranoid delusions. People who walked out into the snow and vanished, either succumbing to the cold or perhaps finding a kind of peace in that final, frozen solitude. We can scarcely imagine the psychological toll of a Viking winter. Modern people struggle with isolation after a few weeks. The Norse endured it for months, every single year, with no end in sight beyond the vague hope that spring would eventually come. Some of them broke under the strain. Most endured, but endurance left marks on the mind as surely as frostbite left marks on the body. This kind of suffering, though, was intensely personal. Let's shift our focus to how winter affected the social fabric of Norse communities. Norse society was built on kinship networks, on obligations and reciprocity, on the bonds between family members and between neighbours. These bonds were essential to survival. No individual or even nuclear family could make it through winter alone. But the stress of winter tested these bonds to their breaking point and beyond. Consider the fundamental structure of a Norse household. It wasn't a modern nuclear family. It was an extended family unit. Multiple generations, often multiple brothers with their families, all living under one roof. Add in the thralls, and you had a community of 20 to 40 people whose survival depended on cooperation. In summer, with work taking people outside, with travel possible, with feasts and gatherings providing outlets, this arrangement worked reasonably well. Picture, if you will, that same household in the depths of winter. Everyone is confined together, stressed, hungry, cold, in poor health. The patriarch of the household, usually the eldest male, holds authority, but that authority is constantly challenged by the circumstances. He's responsible for rationing food, assigning work, maintaining order. These are decisions that affect survival, and not everyone will agree with them. Perhaps the patriarch decides that food must be rationed more severely, that portions must be cut. This is sensible from a survival standpoint, but it means people go to bed hungry, and hungry people are irritable people. Resentments build. Why does he seem to have more food? Why are his children eating more than mine? The accusations may or may not be true, but in the pressure cooker of the Longhouse they feel true. What made this truly brutal was the treatment of the most vulnerable. The thralls, the very young, the very old. When resources were scarce, decisions had to be made about who ate and who went hungry. Thralls were routinely underfed, their survival less important than that of free family members. The elderly, who could no longer work productively, were sometimes seen as burdens. There are accounts of elderly people being helped into the cold, a euphemism for abandonment and exposure. This wasn't universally true. Many families cared for their elders lovingly, but the pressure was there, the terrible calculus that fewer mouths meant more food for those remaining. Inter-family tensions were equally fraught. If two brothers shared a household, their relationship would be tested by winter stress. Arguments over work distribution, over whose children were behaving badly, over division of resources, these could escalate into feuds that lasted generations. The sagas are full of such feuds, and many began during winter when stress and confinement made resolution impossible. And here's a particularly dark aspect: the breakdown of trust. In a society where survival depended on cooperation, trust was currency. But winter eroded trust. People hoarded food privately, hiding supplies from the communal stores. Theft became common, someone stealing from the food stores, someone taking more than their share of clothing or blankets. When caught, the thief faced severe punishment, but the damage to community trust was done. Everyone became a little more suspicious, a little more guarded. The enforcement of order often fell to violence. Corporal punishment was accepted and common. Beatings for thralls, for children, for anyone who violated the rules or challenged authority. But violence breeds resentment and fear, not loyalty. By the end of winter, many households were held together not by genuine bonds of affection, but by fear and grim necessity. Women occupied a particularly difficult position. They were responsible for much of the domestic labour, cooking, spinning, weaving, childcare, but had little formal authority. A woman whose husband or father was abusive had few options. She couldn't leave, not in winter. If she complained, who would help her? The social structure prioritised male authority and lineage continuation. Women were essential to that system, but often treated as property more than people. Children learned these dynamics early. They learned that power came from physical strength and social position. They learned that the weak were expendable. They learned to suppress their own needs and to never show weakness. This wasn't good for developing healthy, emotionally balanced adults, but it was adaptive for survival in a brutal world. It's hard not to reflect on how winter pressure revealed the fault lines in Norse society. The bonds that held in summer frayed or broke in winter, and while spring brought relief, the damage done to relationships and trust during the dark months often persisted. Yet even as social bonds frayed, the community still had to function, had to get work done. Let's talk about the labour that kept households running through winter. One might think that winter was a time of rest for the Norse, a season when agricultural work ceased and people could simply hunker down by the fire. Nothing could be further from the truth. Winter brought different work, but no less demanding, and the consequences of not working were just as severe as in summer. Imagine a typical day in a Norse longhouse in January. The day begins before dawn, though dawn is a relative term when the sun might not rise at all. Someone, usually a thrall, has been tending the fire through the night. Others rouse themselves from cold sleep, reluctantly leaving the meagre warmth of their bedding. The first tasks are immediate and universal. Feed the fire, melt water, prepare the morning meal. But that's just the beginning. The livestock need attention. Goats and sheep must be milked, even though their production is low in winter. They need to be fed hay or straw that was stored during summer, precious resources carefully rationed. Their pens must be cleaned. Animal waste accumulates quickly, and in the cold it doesn't decompose, it just builds up, creating an ever-worsening smell and health hazard. Someone has to shovel it out, heavy, frozen manure, and carry it outside to be heaped somewhere away from the living quarters. Tools and equipment need constant maintenance. In the cold, iron becomes brittle, wood cracks, leather stiffens. So there's ongoing work sharpening axes and knives, repairing broken implements, oiling leather harnesses and belts to keep them supple. This is skilled work, requiring knowledge passed down through generations, and if it's not done, you face spring with broken tools and no way to work the land. What made this truly brutal was the work that consumed the women of the household, textile production. Clothing was wealth, was survival, and it wore out constantly. Every member of the household needed multiple layers of wool clothing, and wool doesn't last forever. It wears thin, develops holes, gets damaged by moths and moisture. So spinning and weaving never stopped. Picture a woman sitting near the fire, a spindle in her hand, drawing out woolen fibres into thread. This is painstaking work, requiring skill and constant attention. The thread must be consistent in thickness, twisted just right, or it will break when woven. An experienced spinner might produce perhaps half a mile of thread in a day of steady work. To make enough cloth for one tunic requires miles of thread. A household might need dozens of garments replaced or repaired each year. Then the thread must be woven into cloth. The upright loom was a fixture in every longhouse, and weaving was hypnotic, repetitive work that went on for hours, days, weeks. The clack of the heddle, the thump of the beater, the slow growth of fabric on the loom. This was the soundtrack of winter. And once you had cloth, it had to be made into garments, which required more skilled labour. Cutting the cloth without wasting material, sewing it together with even stitches that would hold under stress. Needles were precious items, carefully guarded. Thread for sewing came from the same laboriously spun wool or from flax, equally labour-intensive. Food preparation was another endless task. Grain had to be ground into flour, back-breaking work using hand mills, rotating one stone against another with the grain in between. Bread had to be baked, but this wasn't like modern baking. The dough was dense and heavy, more flatbread than what we'd recognise, cooked on hot stones or in primitive ovens. Dried fish and meat had to be soaked, prepared, cooked until somewhat edible. Every meal required hours of labour. And here's where the social hierarchy becomes starkest. This labour fell primarily on women and thralls. Free men did some work, maintaining buildings, crafting weapons and tools, occasionally hunting if conditions permitted. But much of the daily survival labour was done by those lowest in the social hierarchy. Thralls particularly lived a life of unrelenting labour. Their day started earlier and ended later than anyone else's. They did the dirtiest, hardest, most unpleasant work. And they did it knowing that their reward was barely enough food to survive, no freedom, and the constant threat of violence if their work was deemed inadequate. We can scarcely imagine the exhaustion of this constant labour, the knowledge that there was always more work to do, that rest was a luxury only the elite could afford. The Norse worked through winter because they had no choice, because stopping meant death. But this doesn't mean the work was sustainable or healthy. It ground people down, wore out bodies and spirits, contributed to the chronic stress that defined winter existence. Yet work at least kept people occupied. In some ways, the hardest times were those moments of forced inactivity, when there was nothing to do but sit in the darkness and think. Let's explore what the Norse did to fill those dark, empty hours. Entertainment and distraction during Viking winter were crucial for mental health, providing brief escapes from the grinding monotony and stress. Yet the options were limited, and the darkness itself often served as the canvas on which imagination painted its most disturbing pictures. Picture, if you will, an evening in the longhouse. The day's work is done, the fire is burning, and perhaps 30 people sit in the flickering light. There's no television, no books for most people, no radio, no internet. What do you do with the long, dark hours before sleep? The primary entertainment was storytelling. The Norse oral tradition was rich and sophisticated, with professional skalds who memorised and recited complex poetry and sagas. But every household had its storytellers too, usually the eldest members, repositories of family history and traditional tales. They would recite the old stories, tales of gods and heroes, of Odin and Thor, of the creation of the world and the prophecy of its ending. These weren't just entertainment, they were education, cultural transmission, a way of anchoring identity in the face of winter's erasure of difference. But the stories told around winter fires had a particular character. They were often dark, tales of betrayal and revenge, of monsters lurking in the night, of the dead returning to trouble the living. The long darkness lent itself to ghost stories, and the Norse had a rich tradition of them. Stories of Draga, the undead who guarded their burial mounds and attacked the living. Stories of malevolent spirits who preyed on travellers foolish enough to venture out in winter darkness. What made this truly disturbing was that these stories reflected genuine fears and beliefs. The Norse believed that winter was when the boundaries between worlds weakened, when supernatural threats were most active. So the stories served both to frighten and to instruct, teaching the young what dangers to watch for, reinforcing the importance of protective rituals and taboos. Games provided another diversion. The Norse played board games, particularly a game called Nefertafl, similar to chess but with different rules. Boards have been found in archaeological excavations, sometimes elaborate and beautiful, carved from wood or bone. Playing these games in the firelight, the pieces casting long shadows, men would spend hours in strategic competition. Dice games were popular too, and like board games, often involved gambling, betting food, tools, small valuables on the outcome. But gambling had its dark side. Men who had little could lose everything on a bad throw of the dice. Arguments over games could turn violent. There are saga accounts of feuds beginning over disputed game outcomes, of men killing each other over perceived cheating. Music was another remedy for boredom. Simple instruments, bone flutes, lyres, drums, provided accompaniment to songs. The Norse sang work songs, drinking songs, songs commemorating heroes and battles. But winter songs had a melancholic quality, reflecting the season's oppression. They sang of longing for spring, of losses endured, of those who died in past winters. Children had their games and toys, carved wooden figures, simple dolls, imaginative play. But children's play in winter was constrained by space and darkness. They couldn't run and explore as they did in summer. Their games were quieter, more confined, and they grew bored and fractious easily, adding to household stress. And then there was work as entertainment. This sounds contradictory, but many of the tasks that filled winter days, spinning, carving, crafting, had an element of skill and creativity that made them engaging. A skilled craftsperson took pride in their work, found satisfaction in creating something beautiful or useful. This wasn't entertainment in a modern sense, but it was better than sitting idle in the darkness. Some communities managed more elaborate entertainments. If weather permitted, there might be visits between neighbouring farms, feasts where precious food stores were shared, where people could see new faces and hear new stories. These were rare and highly valued, breaks in the monotony that people would remember and talk about for weeks afterward. But for many, especially the poorest, entertainment was a luxury. They worked until exhausted, ate their meagre meal and slept in the darkness, only to wake and do it again. The psychological impact of this unrelieved monotony was severe, contributing to the depression and mental health problems we discussed earlier. It's hard not to think about how much we take for granted, the endless entertainments available at the touch of a screen, the ability to alleviate boredom almost instantly. The Norse lived with boredom as a constant companion, finding what relief they could in stories and songs and games, but never truly escaping the weight of the dark, empty hours. Yet boredom was perhaps the least of the psychological burdens. Let's talk about something more primal, the constant proximity to death. Death was not abstract for the Norse. It wasn't something that happened primarily to the old and sick in hospitals, sanitised and removed from daily life. Death was immediate, present, a regular visitor to every household, and winter was its busiest season. Consider the geography of a Norse farm. The living quarters, the longhouse, was the centre. Nearby were outbuildings, storage structures, workshops, and not far away, often within sight of the hall, was the family burial ground. Previous generations lay beneath mounds of earth and stone, sometimes marked, sometimes simply remembered. The dead were not distant, they were neighbours. Picture a harsh winter morning. Someone dies, an infant who couldn't fight off pneumonia, an elderly person who simply couldn't endure another season, a woman dead from childbirth complications. The body is there, in the longhouse, growing cold and stiff. It needs to be dealt with, but the ground is frozen solid. You can't dig a grave in frozen earth with the tools available. It's literally impossible in the depths of winter. So what do you do with the dead? The body might be wrapped in cloth or hide and placed outside in an outbuilding, where the cold prevents rapid decomposition. It remains there, frozen, until spring thaw when burial becomes possible. Imagine walking past that outbuilding every day, knowing that inside are the frozen corpses of family members, waiting for the earth to soften enough to receive them. What made this truly brutal was that this wasn't rare. In a community of 30 or 40 people, you might see 3, 4, 5 deaths over the course of a winter. Infant mortality alone could account for multiple deaths. So the outbuilding of the dead filled up, and you lived your daily life in close proximity to death, to bodies, to the physical reality of mortality. The psychological impact of this proximity to death was profound. For children, death was normalised in ways modern Western children rarely experience. They saw bodies. They saw the rituals of preparing the dead. They understood from a very young age that they too would die, probably sooner rather than later given the mortality rates. This created a culture with a particular relationship to death, fatalistic in some ways, matter of fact, but also deeply concerned with dying well, with being remembered. Religious beliefs around death took on heightened importance in winter. The Norse believed in an afterlife, Valhalla for warriors, hell for most others, possibly other realms depending on how one lived and died. Burial practices were elaborate when possible, with grave goods, offerings, sometimes ship burials for the wealthy. But in winter, elaborate funerals had to wait. The dead got temporary treatment, and the living worried whether this dishonoured them, whether their spirits would be angry, whether they would return as Draugr. And here's a particularly disturbing aspect: the fear of the dead returning. Norse ghost stories weren't just entertainment, they reflected genuine belief that the dead, especially those improperly buried or who died violently or with unfinished business, could and would return. Winter, with its long darkness, was when such returns were most likely. So every unexplained noise, every shadow seen from the corner of the eye, every nightmare that woke you in the dark could be interpreted as a visitation from the dead. Some deaths were harder to bear than others. A child's death devastated parents, but was so common that communities had rituals and expectations for how to mourn and move on. An adult's death in the prime of life, a hunter who fell through ice, a woman dead in childbirth, a man killed by a falling tree branch. These deaths were tragedies that affected the whole household. They meant loss of labour, loss of knowledge and skill, loss of someone whose contributions to survival were tangible and essential. And then there were the deaths that were deliberately caused or allowed, the exposure of unwanted infants, the elderly walking into the snow, the thrall who became too ill to work and was denied food and medical care. These weren't officially sanctioned deaths, but they happened, and everyone knew they happened. The moral weight of these deaths was borne by the entire community, a communal guilt that no amount of rationalisation could entirely erase. The spring, when it finally came, brought a grim task: burying the winter dead. The frozen bodies had to be thawed, prepared, buried in earth that was finally soft enough to dig. This was sorrowful work, made more difficult by the decomposition that began once the bodies thawed. But it was also necessary closure, a way of honouring the dead and allowing the living to move forward. We can scarcely imagine living so intimately with death, with mortality not as an abstract future event, but as a present reality that shaped daily life. The Norse did this every winter, and it shaped their culture, their beliefs, their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that was fundamentally hostile to human life. But death from natural causes, however tragic, was only one form of winter mortality. Let's talk about the darker forms: violence and murder. Confined spaces, stress, hunger, darkness, and alcohol. When you put these factors together, you get violence. Winter brought out the worst in human nature, and Norse longhouses were often scenes of brutality that the saga literature only hints at. Consider the psychology of a man. Let's make him free but not wealthy, responsible for a family, living in a longhouse with his extended family and several thralls. It's February. The food is running low. His children are hungry and crying. His wife is exhausted and short-tempered. A thrall has been lazy, or he perceives laziness, a failure to work as hard as required. The rage that builds in this man is a kind of madness born of helplessness. He can't make spring come faster. He can't make food appear. But he can assert control through violence. Picture him grabbing the thrall, beating them with fists or with a stick, the blows landing hard and brutal. The thrall can't fight back. To do so would mean death or mutilation as punishment. So they endure, and the man feels a terrible satisfaction, a release of pressure, even as part of him knows this solves nothing. But in that moment, violence is relief. Domestic violence against women and children followed similar patterns. A man's frustration and fear had to go somewhere, and it often landed on the most vulnerable members of his household. Women were beaten for insufficient work, for talking back, for imagined slights. Children were beaten as discipline, but also as outlets for rage that had nowhere else to go. The close quarters meant everyone witnessed these beatings, but intervention was rare. A man's household was his domain, and others were reluctant to interfere. What made this truly disturbing was that violence was normalised and often legally sanctioned. The Norse legal code, preserved in later written laws but based on earlier oral traditions, recognised a man's right to discipline his household, including through physical force. Killing a thrall wasn't murder in the legal sense. It was destruction of property, and the owner could do with his property as he wished. But violence extended beyond disciplinary beatings. Winter brought interpersonal conflicts to a head, and the Norse had a cultural framework for addressing serious grievances, the blood feud. If one man believed another had wronged him or his family, he had not just the right but the obligation to seek revenge. In summer, this might involve raiding the enemy's farm, killing livestock, burning buildings. In winter, confined together or in neighbouring farmsteads, feuds turned personal and immediate. Men fought duels in the snow outside longhouses, armed with swords and axes, fighting until one yielded or died. But more common were ambush killings. A man would wait until his enemy ventured outside to relieve himself or to get water, then attack in the darkness. The body might not be found until morning, frozen in the snow, and everyone would know who'd done it. But proving it and exacting justice were different matters. Some killings were premeditated and cold. A family that had a grudge against another family might decide that winter, when the target was vulnerable and when the crime would be harder to investigate or retaliate against immediately, was the perfect time to strike. They'd arrive at the longhouse, force entry, and murder everyone inside, down to the children and thralls. The sagas record such events, describing them matter-of-factly, as though they were weather events rather than atrocities. And then there was the violence that came from sheer desperation. When food ran out, when starvation became imminent, the weakest was sometimes sacrificed, and not always voluntarily. There are fragmentary accounts of households turning on their weakest members, thralls, the elderly, the sick, and killing them to reduce the number of mouths to feed. These weren't judicial executions. They were murder driven by the mathematics of survival. Alcohol worsened everything. The Norse brewed ale and mead, and drinking was a central part of social life. But in winter, with nothing else to do and tension running high, drinking often led to violence. Men got drunk and fought over trivial slights, old grievances or nothing at all. Women were assaulted. Injuries were common, broken bones, knife wounds, sometimes deaths that were dismissed as accidents, but which everyone suspected were murders. The really dark aspect was that this violence was cyclical. A child raised in a violent household learned that violence was how you solved problems, how you asserted control, how you coped with fear and helplessness. They grew up to replicate the patterns they'd witnessed, and the cycle continued generation after generation. It's hard not to reflect on how winter brought out the worst in people, how the combination of stress and confinement broke down the social norms that kept violence in check during other seasons. The Norse were capable of great cooperation and mutual support, but they were also capable of terrible cruelty, and winter was when that cruelty most often manifested. Yet not all deaths in winter were from violence or disease. Some were more mundane but equally deadly. Let's talk about accidents. Winter's everyday tasks were fraught with mortal danger. The Norse lived in an environment where a simple mistake, a misstep, a moment of carelessness, a tool failure, could lead to injury or death. Understanding these dangers reveals just how much skill and constant vigilance survival required. Picture a man going out to gather wood from the storage pile. It's still dark at midday. The ground is covered in ice beneath fresh snow, and the temperature is well below freezing. He's wearing leather boots with crude traction, but ice is ice. One misstep and he falls, hitting his head on frozen ground hard as stone. Unconscious, he lies in the snow. If he's found quickly, he might survive with nothing worse than a concussion and frostbite. If he's not found, if the blow was severe enough, he dies there, freezing as his body's attempts to wake him fail. Falling through ice was one of the most feared winter dangers. Streams, ponds, and even coastal waters froze over, and ice that looked solid might conceal weak spots. A person walking across to fetch water or to travel to a neighbouring farm could break through without warning. The shock of immersion in near-freezing water often caused involuntary gasping, inhaling water into the lungs. Even if you didn't drown immediately, you had perhaps 10 to 15 minutes before cold water robbed your muscles of function, before hypothermia made it impossible to climb out, and if no one witnessed your fall, if you were alone, those minutes weren't enough. What made this truly brutal was that these accidents were entirely preventable in hindsight, but nearly impossible to prevent in practice. You needed water, so someone had to go to the water source, ice or no ice. You needed to travel between farms sometimes, for trading or for social cohesion, or to deliver messages, so people travelled despite the risks. Every trip outside was a calculated gamble. Usually you'd be fine, but occasionally you wouldn't. Fire was both saviour and killer. The longhouse fire was essential, but it was also dangerous. Sparks could escape, landing in the dry straw bedding or the wooden structure itself. In the close quarters and smoky atmosphere, a fire could start and spread before anyone noticed. A structure fire in winter was catastrophic. People trapped inside as flames blocked the exits, the heat so intense that escape was impossible. And even if you escaped the fire itself, you were then outside in winter with no shelter, which was its own death sentence. Burns were common accidents. Someone leaning too close to the fire, clothing catching flame. Children, curious and careless, getting too near the flames and being scarred for life. Hands and arms burned while cooking or tending the fire. The injuries compounded by poor medical care and the risk of infection. Tools were another source of injury. Axes and knives were used constantly, often in cold conditions where hands were numb and coordination was impaired. A slip while chopping wood could result in a deep gash to the leg or foot. An axe head flying off its handle could strike someone standing nearby. These injuries, in an age before antibiotics, often became infected. What started as a painful but manageable wound could progress to blood poisoning, to sepsis, to death over the course of days or weeks. And here's a particularly disturbing category of winter accidents: structural failures. The weight of snow on roofs was immense, especially after prolonged storms. Roofs could collapse without warning, trapping and crushing people inside. Buildings weakened by age or poor maintenance could fail during storms, walls caving in, or entire structures toppling. These disasters killed not just the occupants, but sometimes destroyed food stores, dooming survivors to starvation. Avalanches were another danger in mountainous regions. The Norse built in valleys and on slopes, often in areas prone to snowslides. A warm day followed by refreezing, or a particularly heavy snowfall could trigger avalanches that buried farms completely. Entire families disappeared under tons of snow, their bodies not recovered until spring thaw revealed the catastrophe. Childbirth, though a natural process, was fraught with danger and could be considered an accident of biology. Women died from hemorrhage, from infections, from obstructed labour where the baby couldn't be delivered. Midwives did what they could, but their knowledge was limited and their tools primitive. A baby stuck in the birth canal might require forceful extraction that killed both mother and child. These deaths were tragic but common enough that every woman knew the risks she faced. We can scarcely imagine living in an environment where daily tasks carried genuine mortal risk, where going outside or cooking a meal or travelling to see a neighbour could be the last thing you ever did. The Norse accepted these risks because they had no choice, but acceptance didn't mean the losses were easy to bear. Each accident diminished the community, removed a person whose labour and knowledge and presence couldn't be easily replaced, and winter just kept producing these accidents, one after another, a relentless toll that added up by spring. But perhaps nothing reveals the brutality of Viking winters more starkly than what happened when things went wrong with food storage. Let's examine that dark topic now. We've discussed the challenge of food storage and rationing, but let's look more closely at what happened in the worst case scenario, when despite all planning and effort the food ran out before spring arrived. This was the nightmare that haunted every Norse farmer, and it happened more often than you might think. Consider a household in March. Winter has stretched on longer than usual, spring is late, and the snow shows no sign of melting. They've been rationing for months already, but now they're down to the dregs. The grain barrels are empty. The dried fish is gone. There's perhaps a week's worth of meat left, maybe 2 if they stretch it to near starvation levels. And still, the snow falls. Picture the household gathered around the fire, the conversation that must happen. How do we survive the next weeks? The options are all terrible. They can slaughter breeding livestock, eating the animals they need for next year's calves and milk and wool. This saves them now but dooms them later. Without breeding stock, the farm cannot recover. They can send people out to try to hunt or fish in impossible conditions, risking those lives in the hope of finding food. Or they can reduce the number of mouths to feed. This last option was implemented in ways both direct and indirect. Direct meant simply denying food to certain people. Thralls first, then the elderly, then the sick, essentially starving them to death while others ate. Indirect meant encouraging or even forcing people to leave, to strike out on their own in a futile search for food or shelter elsewhere. This was exile disguised as autonomy, and everyone knew what it meant. Those sent out died, usually within days, from cold or hunger or both. What made this truly horrifying was that these decisions were made by families about family members. A son had to decide whether his elderly mother would eat. A father had to choose which children were most likely to survive, and therefore deserved the remaining food. These weren't decisions that could be made rationally or without emotional devastation. They tore families apart, created guilt and trauma that lasted the rest of the survivors' lives. Starvation itself is a brutal death. The body, deprived of calories, begins to consume itself. First goes the fat, what little there is after months of poor diet. Then the body breaks down muscle tissue, including heart muscle. The person becomes skeletal, their face hollow, their movements sluggish and weak. The mind deteriorates. Thinking becomes difficult. Decision-making impaired. Starvation produces apathy, a kind of giving up where the person just lies down and waits to die. Children starve the fastest, their smaller bodies having fewer reserves. Watching a child starve, seeing them cry from hunger that can't be satisfied, seeing them waste away despite desperate attempts to keep them alive. This was a torment that broke parents utterly. Some parents reportedly ate tree bark and shoe leather, while giving their last scraps of real food to their children, sacrificing themselves slowly in the hope of keeping the young alive. And then there were the rumours, the whispered fears that sometimes became reality. Cannibalism. When starvation was severe enough, when all other options had been exhausted, some Norse communities turned to eating the dead. This was the ultimate taboo, a violation so profound that marked those who did it forever, even if they survived. But in the face of death, some chose to live by any means necessary. The bodies of those who died were sometimes butchered, the meat smoked or salted like any other meat. Families tried to keep it secret, but in the close quarters of a longhouse, secrets were impossible to keep. Everyone knew, but no one spoke of it directly. The psychological damage of eating human flesh, of feeding it to children, of knowing that survival came at the cost of humanity itself. This was damage that never fully healed. Spring, when it came, found these households devastated. Those who survived were weak, sick, traumatized. The farm was in disrepair, the livestock depleted or gone entirely, the family structure broken by death and by the terrible choices made during the dark months. Recovery was possible but never complete. The scars remained. It's hard not to think about the desperation that drove people to such extremes. These weren't evil people or weak people. They were ordinary people pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, facing impossible choices in a world that offered no good options. The Norse remembered these winters in their sagas and their cautionary tales, using them as measuring sticks for hardship. It was a hard winter, but not like the winter when they ate the dead. This was the benchmark of suffering, and it happened within living memory for every generation. But starvation wasn't the only way winter killed. Disease, often working in conjunction with malnutrition, was equally deadly. Let's explore the sickness that winter brought. Winter was disease season. The combination of close quarters, poor nutrition, cold, stress, and inadequate hygiene created perfect conditions for infectious disease to flourish. The Norse had no understanding of germ theory, no antibiotics, no effective medicine for most illnesses. When disease struck, all they could do was suffer through it and hope to survive. Consider respiratory illnesses, the most common winter afflictions. One person catches a cold from exposure to the weather or from someone else in the household. In the close quarters of the longhouse, where everyone shares air thick with smoke and where people sleep side by side, that cold spreads rapidly. Within days, everyone is coughing and sneezing, their noses running, their throats raw. Picture the sound inside a longhouse during a respiratory illness outbreak. Constant coughing, day and night. The wet, gurgling cough that signals pneumonia. The gasping breaths of children whose small airways are clogged with mucus. The moans of people in pain, their chests aching from the force of coughing. And no relief, no decongestants, no cough syrup, no antibiotics if it progresses to bacterial infection. For most people, these illnesses were miserable, but survivable. But for the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by malnutrition or other conditions, respiratory infections were often fatal. Pneumonia killed quickly. A person would be slightly ill one day, and drowning in their own lungs 3 days later. Babies, unable to nurse because they couldn't breathe through congested noses, died from a combination of infection and starvation. What made this truly brutal was the helplessness. Parents watched their children struggle to breathe, tried to help by holding them upright or creating steam to loosen the mucus, but often these efforts were futile. The infection progressed, the lungs filled with fluid, and the child died, sometimes in their parents' arms, sometimes while the parents slept exhausted a few feet away. Gastrointestinal diseases were another winter scourge. Food contamination was difficult to prevent. Preserved food went bad, water sources were contaminated, and in the dark people couldn't always see what they were eating. Dysentery spread through households like wildfire, producing severe diarrhea and vomiting that quickly led to dehydration. In summer, dehydration could be treated by drinking water. In winter, when you were already cold, when heating water required fuel you might not have, when the patient couldn't keep anything down, dehydration was often fatal. People died from gastrointestinal diseases not because the illness itself was necessarily lethal, but because they couldn't maintain hydration long enough for their bodies to fight off the infection. And here's a particularly disturbing detail. The contagious nature of these illnesses meant that caregivers became victims. A mother caring for sick children would inevitably become sick herself. Then she couldn't care for anyone, and her children's chances of survival plummeted. Sometimes entire households would be incapacitated simultaneously, everyone too sick to maintain the fire, prepare food, fetch water. If this happened and no neighbours came to help, the household could be found dead come spring, not necessarily from the disease itself, but from the cascade of failures that followed. Tuberculosis was a chronic winter killer. This bacterial infection of the lungs could lie dormant for years, then activate during periods of stress, poor nutrition, and overcrowding. Exactly the conditions of Viking winter. A person with TB coughed constantly, bringing up blood-tinged sputum, growing progressively weaker as the disease destroyed lung tissue. TB was a slow death, sometimes taking months or even years, and it was highly contagious. One TB patient in a longhouse could infect multiple others, who would then develop the disease and spread it further. Skin infections were rampant. The combination of poor hygiene, lice, scratching, itchy skin, and close contact meant that any break in the skin could become infected. A small cut or scratch would become red and swollen, then fill with pus, then spread as the infection entered the bloodstream. Sepsis killed quickly and painfully, raging fever, delirium, organ failure. There was no treatment beyond lancing the wound to drain pus and hoping the body could fight off the infection on its own. The Norse had some herbal remedies: poultices made from plants known to have healing properties, teas brewed from bark and leaves, rituals and prayers to the gods. Some of these remedies may have had mild beneficial effects. Most were placebo at best, actively harmful at worst. But they gave people something to do, some sense of agency in the face of illness that was otherwise utterly beyond their control. We can scarcely imagine the fear of disease in a world without effective medicine. Every cough, every fever, every outbreak of rash could be the beginning of an epidemic that would decimate the household. The Norse lived with this fear constantly, and winter was when that fear was most acute. Some winters, disease killed more people than starvation or cold, sweeping through communities and leaving devastation in its wake. But disease wasn't just a matter of bad luck or chance. There were spiritual dimensions to illness that we must understand to fully grasp the Viking winter experience. Let's turn to those darker beliefs. The Norse didn't understand disease in biological terms, but they weren't ignorant either. They recognized patterns. Certain illnesses spread from person to person. Certain symptoms indicated particular diseases. Certain remedies sometimes helped. But they also believed that illness and misfortune had spiritual causes, that the invisible world influenced the physical world in ways both subtle and obvious. Consider the Norse cosmology. The world was populated not just by humans and animals, but by a vast array of spirits and supernatural entities. There were landvetir, land spirits that inhabited natural features like rocks, trees and streams. There were Disir, female spirits associated with families and fate. There were trolls and giants and elves of various types. And there were the dead themselves, who didn't always stay peacefully buried. Picture a household facing repeated misfortunes. Livestock dying, children falling ill, tools breaking, accidents mounting. The patriarch consults with the household's wise woman, someone skilled in cedar, the Norse magical tradition. She performs divination, perhaps going into a trance state, seeking to understand what supernatural force is causing the problems. Perhaps, she announces, the farm is being plagued by a draugr, an angry undead creature who is improperly buried. Or maybe someone has cursed the family, using magic to bring misfortune upon them. The remedies for spiritual afflictions were varied. Protective runes might be carved on doorposts and buildings, symbols believed to ward off malevolent forces. Offerings might be made to landvetir or to the gods, asking for their protection. If a specific dead person was believed to be causing trouble, their grave might be opened and the body dealt with, decapitated, with the head placed at the corpse's feet, or staked through with iron to prevent it from walking. What made this truly disturbing was the belief in curses and malevolent magic. The Norse believed that someone with knowledge of Seidr or Goldor, magical chanting, could cause harm at a distance. An enemy could curse your family, bringing sickness, death and misfortune. This belief created paranoia, especially in winter when people were stressed and looking for explanations for their suffering. Who had cursed them? Which neighbour harboured resentment? Was the string of bad luck natural or supernatural? Accusations of curse-making could tear communities apart. If someone was believed to have cursed a household, revenge was appropriate and expected. This might mean violence, even killing the suspected curse-caster. But proving someone had used magic was difficult, often relying on confessions extracted under threat or torture. Innocent people were undoubtedly killed based on these accusations, their deaths adding to winter's toll. And here's a particularly dark aspect. The use of folk magic for malevolent purposes was real, in the sense that people genuinely attempted it. There are accounts of people creating effigies of their enemies and ritually damaging them, believing this would cause corresponding harm to the person represented. They brewed poisons and potions designed to sicken or kill. They uttered curses and binding spells. Whether these efforts had supernatural effect is debatable, but they had real psychological effects. Knowing someone was trying to curse you was terrifying and created stress that could manifest as physical symptoms. Protective magic was practiced widely. Amulets were worn, Thor's hammers, carved stones inscribed with runes, herbs believed to have protective properties. Women practiced household magic designed to keep their families safe. Charms against fire, spells to ensure the butter churned properly, rituals to bless the threshold against malevolent intrusions. This folk magic was woven into daily life, a constant background hum of spiritual protection against a world perceived as hostile and unpredictable. Children were particularly vulnerable to supernatural attack, or so it was believed. Newborns might be carried around the fire in a specific ritual pattern, sprinkled with water, named quickly to establish their identity and make them real, in both the physical and spiritual sense. Until these rituals were performed, a baby was considered liminal, not fully part of the human world, and therefore vulnerable to being stolen or replaced by supernatural beings. The psychological comfort provided by these beliefs and practices shouldn't be underestimated. Having a framework for understanding misfortune, having rituals to perform that might help, having someone, the curse-caster, to blame. This gave people a sense of agency, of not being entirely helpless in the face of winter's brutality. But it also created additional fear and paranoia, adding psychological distress to the already heavy burden of winter survival. It's hard not to reflect on how deeply the Norse believed in an invisible world that intersected with their daily lives, especially in winter when the barrier between worlds was thought to be weakest. Their supernatural beliefs shaped their actions, their relationships, their understanding of why suffering happened. Modern people might see superstition, but for the Norse, this was reality. And that reality included one more winter threat we haven't fully explored: the psychological toll of endless darkness. Let's revisit that theme, diving deeper into the abyss of winter madness. We've touched on the mental health impacts of Viking winter, but let's examine more closely the specific phenomenon of what the Norse might have called darkness sickness, the profound psychological deterioration that extended darkness and isolation produced in susceptible individuals. Consider the neurobiology of light exposure. Human brains produce serotonin in response to bright light, particularly sunlight. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter intimately involved in mood regulation, impulse control, and social behaviour. When light exposure drops dramatically, as it does during Scandinavian winters, serotonin production plummets. Simultaneously, melatonin production, which makes you sleepy and is suppressed by light, continues unchecked, leaving people perpetually drowsy and lethargic. Picture a person experiencing this neurochemical imbalance, though of course they have no concept of neurotransmitters or hormones. All they know is that as winter deepens and darkness grows, they feel increasingly hopeless, tired, irritable. They sleep more and more, sometimes 16 or 18 hours a day, rising only to eat small amounts before returning to their sleeping platform. When awake, They feel no pleasure, no interest in anything. Work becomes impossible to motivate themselves to do. Social interaction feels pointless and exhausting. This is seasonal affective disorder in its severe form, and for the Norse it was a potentially fatal condition. A person who couldn't work, who couldn't contribute to household survival, became a burden. And unlike temporary illness from which recovery was possible, this darkness sickness could last for months, the entire winter. Some recovered when light returned in spring. Others never quite recovered, their baseline mood permanently lowered by the repeated trauma of winter darkness. What made this truly disturbing was the variability in individual susceptibility. Some people seemed almost immune to darkness sickness, maintaining their energy and mood throughout winter. Others, and no one understood why, plunged into deep depression year after year. This variability created a cruel randomness. Families couldn't predict which members would be incapacitated by darkness sickness, couldn't plan around it, could only watch helplessly as previously. Strong, capable people deteriorated into shadows of themselves, and for those most severely affected, darkness sickness could progress to what we might now recognise as psychosis. Prolonged sleep deprivation, despite sleeping many hours, the quality was poor. Sensory deprivation, limited light, limited visual stimulation, social isolation, and stress could combine to produce hallucinations and delusions. People heard voices in the crackling of the fire. They saw figures moving in the shadows, figures that disappeared when looked at directly. They became convinced that spirits or monsters had entered the longhouse, invisible to everyone else, but terrifyingly real to them. The saga literature contains references to people going berserk in winter. Though this term has become associated with warrior frenzy, its original meaning may have included a kind of madness induced by winter conditions. A person might suddenly become violent without apparent provocation, attacking family members or destroying property in a frenzy before collapsing into exhausted sleep or stupor. More commonly, darkness sickness manifested as withdrawal and eventual catatonia. The person stopped speaking, stopped moving, lay on their sleeping platform staring at nothing. They might be coaxed to eat small amounts, or they might refuse food entirely. Without modern psychiatric intervention, these severe cases often ended in death. The person essentially gave up on living, and their body followed their mind into darkness. And here's a particularly haunting aspect: the contagious nature of despair. When one person in a household sank into deep depression, their mood affected everyone around them. Depression and hopelessness spread like an infection, lowering the mood of the entire household. This created feedback loops where increasing depression led to decreased motivation and cooperation, which led to household dysfunction, which led to more stress and depression. Some households developed rituals specifically aimed at combating darkness sickness. Enforced social interaction with storytelling and singing even when no one felt like it. Mandatory physical activity, even just walking in circles inside the longhouse. Sharing of whatever small pleasures could be found. A special food saved for the darkest days. A particularly good ale, a fire built larger and brighter than usual for a celebration of the winter solstice, acknowledging that the slow return of light would begin. But not all households had the resources or knowledge to combat darkness sickness effectively. And for those individuals whose biochemistry was particularly vulnerable, no amount of social support or ritual could fully protect them. They suffered through winter after winter, each one taking a heavier toll, until finally, one winter, they didn't emerge from the darkness. We can scarcely imagine the psychological landscape of a Viking winter for someone experiencing severe darkness sickness. The physical environment was hostile enough. Cold, dark, confined, dangerous. But to experience that environment while your own brain chemistry was sabotaging your mood, your motivation, your will to live, this was suffering of a profound and existential nature, and the Norse had no real treatment beyond hope and the distant promise of spring. But beyond the individual psychological toll, there were communal psychological challenges. Let's examine the group dynamics of winter survival. We've looked at individual suffering, but let's zoom out to examine the group psychology of 30 or 40 people confined together for months in a space smaller than most modern apartments. The dynamics that emerged were complex, often toxic, and essential to understand if we want to grasp why Viking winter was so psychologically destructive. Consider the basic human need for personal space. Research suggests humans need both physical space, a certain amount of square footage per person, and psychological space, time alone, time for introspection without constant social demands. In a Norse longhouse, neither form of space existed. The physical space per person was minimal, perhaps 30 to 50 square feet, including sleeping platform and communal areas. And psychological space was non-existent. You were never truly alone, never free from the observation and demands of others. Picture, if you will, a woman trying to have a moment to herself. Perhaps she's grieving the death of a child, or she's angry about some injustice, or she's simply overwhelmed and needs to cry. But there's nowhere to go. Stepping outside in winter isn't an option for any extended period. You'd freeze. The attached outbuildings offer little refuge. They're cold, dark, and used for storage or animals. So she remains in the longhouse, trying to find a corner, trying to turn her face to the wall, but she's still surrounded by people who can hear her cry, who will notice her distress, who might offer comfort or might tell her to stop making a scene. The lack of privacy affected every aspect of life. Intimate moments between partners were public. Everyone heard everything. Bodily functions happened in close proximity to others, in chamber pots or designated corners. Conflicts couldn't be avoided or escaped. They played out in front of the entire household. This constant exposure was exhausting and stripped away the barriers people normally maintain for psychological protection. What made this truly brutal was the formation of social hierarchies and factions within the longhouse. Not everyone liked everyone else. Old rivalries, personality conflicts, competition for status. These created divisions within the household. Factions formed. This person's allies versus that person's allies. In summer, when people could separate, these tensions were manageable. In winter, confined together, they became all-consuming. Power struggles were constant. Who sat closest to the fire? Who got the largest portions of food? Whose children were disciplined for misbehaviour, and whose were allowed to misbehave? These questions became sources of intense conflict, because they represented not just immediate comfort, but status and influence. To lose these battles was to be pushed toward the margins, literally and figuratively, to the cold edges of the longhouse, to smaller food shares, to diminished voice in household decisions. The patriarch's authority was challenged regularly, often through passive-aggressive means. A thrall might work slowly, forcing punishment, but also making a point. A younger brother might question decisions not openly, but through comments to others. Women, excluded from formal authority, wielded influence through other means, managing food distribution, controlling access to domestic resources, forming alliances with other women. These power struggles simmered constantly, occasionally boiling over into open conflict. And here's a particularly disturbing dynamic: scapegoating. When things went wrong, and in winter things frequently went wrong, the household needed someone to blame. Thralls were convenient scapegoats, easily blamed for anything from a poorly maintained fire to bad weather. But scapegoats could also be family members who were weak, different, or simply unpopular. A person might find themselves blamed for household misfortunes, becoming the target of collective hostility. This served a psychological function. It unified the rest of the household against a common enemy, but it was torture for the scapegoat. Some individuals tried to escape the pressure through various means. Excessive sleep was one form of escape. If you're sleeping, you're not dealing with conflict or stress. alcohol provided another escape, though it often worsened problems in the long run. Some people developed what we might call dissociative responses, mentally checking out even while physically present, going through motions mechanically while their minds retreated to internal worlds. But the most successful adaptation was the development of strong social bonds within the chaos. Partnerships formed, two women who worked together and supported each other, siblings who remained close despite the stress, a young person befriending an elder. These bonds provided psychological refuge, a small circle of trust within the larger hostile environment. Households that fostered such bonds, that actively worked to maintain cohesion and mutual support, survived winter psychologically intact more often than households that devolved into factional warfare. It's hard not to think about how extraordinary it was that Norse households held together at all under these conditions. The pressures that could split them apart were enormous and constant. Yet most households did survive, emerging in spring battered but intact. This speaks to both the resilience of the human spirit and to the powerful motivation survival provides. When the alternative to cooperation is death, people find ways to cooperate, however imperfectly. But cooperation had its limits, and when we look at the treatment of the most vulnerable members of Norse society, we see the darkest aspects of winter survival. Let's examine that now. We've mentioned thralls throughout this exploration, but let's look more directly at their experience of Viking winter. Slavery was fundamental to Norse society and economy, and winter revealed with stark clarity the brutal logic that governed the lives of the enslaved. Consider the legal and social status of a thrall. They were property, not persons. They had no rights that free people were obliged to respect. They could be bought, sold, traded, used in whatever way their owner saw fit, and killed if their owner chose. The only limitation was that thralls represented an investment. They had been purchased or captured at some cost, and their labour had value. But in winter, when labour needs decreased and food was scarce, that calculus changed. Picture a thrall. Let's make them a young woman, captured in a raid on the British Isles several years ago. Far from home, speaking limited Norse, owned by a farmer of moderate means. In summer and autumn, she works from before dawn until after dark, tending animals, preparing food, spinning wool, whatever tasks are assigned. Her food is adequate because she needs strength to work. Her treatment, while certainly not kind, is at least rational. Damaging your property doesn't make economic sense. But winter arrives and the dynamics shift. The household's food stores are calculated based on minimal survival for all members, with thralls receiving the least. As winter progresses and food grows scarcer, the thrall's portions shrink further. She's perpetually hungry, weak, cold, because she sleeps in the coldest part of the longhouse and has only thin blankets. Her work doesn't decrease. She still tends the fire, fetches water, prepares food, cleans. But her reward for that work shrinks as the household prioritises the survival of free family members. What made this truly brutal was the expendability of thralls when things got desperate. If food was critically short, thralls were denied food entirely, left to starve while free members ate. The logic was coldly practical. A free family member couldn't be replaced easily and represented kinship ties and social obligations. A thrall could be replaced. Capture another in a summer raid, buy one from a trader. Better the thrall should die than a free person. And thralls knew this. They lived with the knowledge that they were expendable, that their lives were valued only in terms of their labour capacity, that if winter became harsh enough, they would be sacrificed. This knowledge must have been psychologically devastating, creating a state of chronic fear and despair that no amount of outward compliance could fully mask. The sexual exploitation of thrall women was another dark reality. Enya, summer. This happened but might be somewhat limited by the rhythm of work and the presence of others. In winter, confined in the longhouse, with darkness and boredom and proximity, exploitation intensified. Thrall women had no ability to refuse sexual advances from free men. They were raped regularly, and pregnancies resulting from this rape created additional cruelty. The children of thralls were themselves thralls, born into bondage, their paternity rarely acknowledged even when everyone knew who the father was. Male thralls faced their own brutalities. They were worked hardest, fed least, beaten most readily. The dangerous outdoor work in winter, fetching water from frozen streams, gathering wood in brutal cold, repairing structures damaged by storms, fell to male thralls. If they were injured or died in the process, this was unfortunate but acceptable. Their suffering was not a concern that kept free men awake at night. And here's a particularly disturbing aspect: the psychological adaptation thralls had to make to survive. They had to become subservient, to show no anger or resentment even when abused, to perform their roles perfectly while accepting that perfection would not save them if the household decided their survival was inconvenient. This required a kind of psychological self-obliteration, a suppression of natural human emotions and needs so complete that it amounted to a living death. Some thralls broke under this pressure. They became sullen and uncooperative, inviting punishment. They tried to escape. Their winter escape was almost certainly fatal. Where could you go? How could you survive? Some committed suicide, choosing a quick death over slow degradation, and some murdered their masters, knowing they would be killed for it but finding that final act of violence preferable to continued powerlessness. But most thralls endured. They survived winter after winter, year after year, until they were too old or broken to be useful, at which point they were abandoned or killed outright. A few earned their freedom through exceptional service, or through bearing children to their masters who were acknowledged and freed, but these were exceptions. The vast majority of thralls died in bondage, their lives consumed by the survival needs of free Norse society. We can scarcely imagine the horror of being a thrall facing Viking winter. To be cold, hungry, exhausted, abused, and to know that you are considered less valuable than the goats in the pen. To understand that if food runs short, you will be starved first. To live without hope of escape, without hope that your situation will improve. This was the reality for a substantial portion of Norse society. Estimates suggest 10 to 30% of the population were thralls, and winter magnified every aspect of their suffering. Yet even as we acknowledge the horror of thrall experience, we should note that women and children who were free also faced their own winter-specific tragedies. Let's examine those now. The phrase "women and children first" is a modern concept, particularly associated with maritime disaster protocols. In Viking winter, the reality was often the opposite. When survival was at stake, adult free men, the warriors and workers who would rebuild in spring, were prioritised, and women and children, while valued, were considered more expendable in extremis. Consider a pregnant woman facing winter. Pregnancy requires extra calories, roughly 300 to 500 additional calories per day, to support the developing fetus. But winter was when calories were most scarce, when food rationing was strictest. So the pregnant woman faced an impossible choice: eat enough to support the pregnancy, which meant taking food that others needed, or accept inadequate nutrition and risk miscarriage, stillbirth, or delivering a baby too weak to survive. Picture this woman, her belly swelling even as her face grows gaunt from malnutrition. She feels the baby move inside her and wonders whether she's condemning it to death by bringing it into the world in the darkest part of winter. She knows that childbirth itself is dangerous, that many women die from hemorrhage or infection, and that winter births are particularly risky because the cold, the darkness, and the limited resources make complications harder to manage. When labour begins, she lies on a bed of straw in a corner of the longhouse. The midwife, an experienced older woman, attends her, but the midwife's knowledge is limited to traditional practices, some helpful, some useless, some actively harmful. There are no pain medications beyond perhaps some herbal preparations of limited effectiveness. The labour might last hours or days, the woman screaming or biting down on leather to keep from screaming, because showing pain is showing weakness. What made this truly brutal was the frequency of catastrophic outcomes. Obstructed labour, where the baby couldn't pass through the birth canal, was often fatal for both mother and child. Hemorrhage killed quickly, the woman bleeding out on the straw while those attending her could do nothing but watch. Infection set in after birth, puerperal fever that killed over days as the woman burned with fever and then went into shock. By some estimates, 10 to 15% of births resulted in maternal death, and winter births likely had higher mortality rates. And if the mother survived, the baby still faced terrible odds. Low birth weight from maternal malnutrition meant vulnerability to cold, to infection, to any stress. The mother might have inadequate milk production, again due to her own malnutrition, and there were no good alternatives. Animal milk often caused digestive problems in newborns, and other women in the household might not have milk to spare. So the baby weakened, failed to thrive, and died within weeks or months of birth. The decision of whether to let a weak baby die was sometimes made explicitly. Infanticide, particularly of girls or of babies born with obvious defects, was not uncommon. A newborn might be exposed, left outside in the cold, if the household decided it couldn't support another mouth. This was rationalised as practical necessity, but the psychological cost to parents, particularly mothers, was devastating. To give birth to a child and then to participate in or passively allow its death violated fundamental human instincts. Children who survived infancy still faced winter's dangers. Malnutrition stunted their growth and development. Disease killed them with frightening regularity. Pneumonia, dysentery, other infections their small bodies couldn't fight off. Accidents happened. A child falling into the fire, wandering outside and freezing, being crushed by falling objects or collapsing structures. And here's a disturbing aspect: the conditional nature of parental investment in children. Norse parents loved their children, but that love was tempered by the reality that many children didn't survive. Parents couldn't afford to invest fully emotionally in every child, because the grief of losing them was potentially incapacitating. So there was a kind of emotional reserve, a withholding of full attachment until a child was old enough to have good survival odds. This protected parents' mental health, but meant children grew up with a sense of conditional belonging, of having to prove their worth to merit their parents' full affection. Older children, particularly girls, were worked hard in winter. They spun wool, helped with cooking and cleaning, cared for younger siblings, fetched water, all the domestic labour that kept the household running. They received no special consideration for their age. If they couldn't work, they were burden. This created a childhood without much childhood, where play and development were sacrificed to survival needs. Boys faced different pressures. They were being prepared for their future roles as warriors and farmers, which meant being toughened, hardened against pain and fear. Winter training was harsh, being sent outside inadequately clothed to build endurance, being struck to teach them not to show weakness, being deprived of food to teach them to ignore hunger. This was understood as necessary preparation, but it was also traumatic, creating men who could endure hardship, but who had limited capacity for emotional expression or vulnerability. We can scarcely imagine raising children in these conditions, loving them while knowing they might not survive, trying to prepare them for a world this harsh while they were still so young and vulnerable. Norse women and children endured winter with whatever resilience they could muster, but the toll was severe, paid in lives lost and in psychological damage that shaped survivors profoundly. Yet even with all we've discussed, the cold, the hunger, the disease, the darkness, the violence, there were winters that stood out as exceptional in their brutality. Let's turn to those worst-case scenarios now. Throughout the Viking Age, there were winters that became legendary for their severity. These were the winters that tested even the most prepared communities, the winters that killed on a massive scale, the winters that survivors remembered for the rest of their lives and recounted to their children as cautionary tales. Consider the concept of a Fimble winter, a term from Norse mythology referring to the great winter that precedes Ragnarok, lasting 3 years without summer in between. While the mythological version was apocalyptic, the term was likely based on actual winters that were so severe, so long, that they seemed like the end of the world. These weren't winters that came every generation. They were rare, perhaps once in a century or even less frequently. But when they came, entire communities disappeared. Picture a winter that starts early, with snow in September instead of November. The first storms are severe, heavy snowfall that buries buildings to their roofs, winds that tear apart inadequately maintained structures. The cold is extreme, temperatures dropping lower than anyone can remember, staying low week after week without relief. The sun, when it appears at all, is wan and distant, providing no warmth. Such a winter might be caused by volcanic eruptions halfway around the world, spewing ash into the atmosphere that blocked sunlight and cooled the global climate. The Norse had no way of knowing this cause, but they felt the effects. The cold persisted through what should have been spring. The snow remained. Rivers and streams that should have thawed stayed frozen. The ground remained hard as iron. What made these worst winters truly apocalyptic was the cascade of failures they triggered. Food stores that might have been adequate for a normal winter ran out with months still remaining before any chance of harvest. Livestock, already weakened by winter feeding, began dying in large numbers. The surviving animals produced no milk, bore no young. Disease, always present, became epidemic as people weakened by starvation had no resistance. Communities faced impossible decisions. Some chose to evacuate despite the deadly cold. Groups of people set out walking, hoping to reach relatives or trade partners who might have surplus food. Most of these evacuations ended in death. The travellers froze, starved, or were scattered by storms. But staying meant certain death, so some gambled on movement. Other communities turned inward, becoming more ruthless in their survival calculations. They expelled the weak and the vulnerable. They slaughtered all remaining livestock and rationed the meat with absolute strictness. They did unspeakable things. Cannibalism of the recently dead, murder of those deemed least essential, drawing lots to determine who would be sacrificed so others might survive. And here's a particularly haunting aspect of the worst winters: the psychological aftermath for survivors. Those who lived through such a winter were forever changed. They had seen their friends and family die. They had made or participated in terrible choices. They had survived while others, perhaps more worthy, had perished. The guilt and trauma was profound, manifesting in nightmares, in an inability to ever feel secure again, in a kind of perpetual anticipation of catastrophe. The worst winters created lasting changes in Norse society. After particularly severe winters, farms were abandoned, entire valleys depopulated. The survivors consolidated, moving to better lands or being absorbed into other households. The gene pool was affected. Those with particular survival traits, whether physical or psychological, were more likely to survive and reproduce. The culture's understanding of risk and preparation was updated based on the lessons learned. There are historical records, preserved in later written sagas and chronicles, of specific terrible winters. The winter of 1010-1011, mentioned in Icelandic sources, was apparently so severe that it was remembered for generations. The 14th century brought the onset of the Little Ice Age, which made winters progressively worse, and may have contributed to the end of Norse settlements in Greenland. These worst winters weren't just weather events, they were demographic catastrophes that reshaped populations. We can scarcely imagine experiencing a winter so severe that it seemed like the world was ending. The Norse who lived through the worst winters understood viscerally what it meant to be at nature's mercy, to have all human effort and planning rendered inadequate by forces beyond control or comprehension. And yet, some survived. Which brings us to a crucial question. What did the Norse do right? How did they adapt successfully enough to endure centuries of brutal winters? We've focused heavily on the brutality and suffering of Viking winters, but we'd be unfair if we didn't acknowledge the Norse ingenuity and adaptability that allowed them not just to survive but to thrive in one of Earth's harshest inhabited environments. Let's examine the strategies and innovations that worked. Consider, first, the longhouse itself. Yes, we've discussed its claustrophobic nature and its problems, but it was also a remarkable piece of engineering given the materials and knowledge available. The thick turf roof provided excellent insulation. Turf has an R value of roughly 3 per inch, and with several feet of it, you had significant thermal mass that moderated temperature swings. The earth-banked walls, sometimes made with double walling filled with insulation, helped retain heat. The low doorways and minimal windows were deliberate design choices to minimise heat loss. The central fire's positioning was sophisticated. Heat rises, and the smoke helped dry the roof from the inside, preventing rot and ice build-up. The sleeping platforms along the walls placed people above the coldest floor air in the warmest part of the building. Heat stratification meant that the upper portion of the longhouse was significantly warmer than the floor level. And bringing livestock inside while creating odour and sanitation problems genuinely contributed meaningful heat. A cow produces roughly the same heat as a small space heater. Picture the food preservation techniques the Norse developed. Smoking, salting and drying were sophisticated processes that required knowledge of moisture content, temperature, timing and technique. A properly smoked fish could last 6 months or more without refrigeration. Fermentation preserved dairy products. Skyr, a fermented milk product, was nutritious and shelf-stable. Cheese making, butter production, and the storage of grain in pest-resistant containers showed deep understanding of how to manage food resources. The autumn slaughter was carefully timed and executed. Animals that wouldn't survive winter were butchered when they were still healthy and heavy, maximising the meat yield. The slaughter was comprehensive. Nothing wasted. Hides became clothing and blankets. Bones were used for tools, ground for meal, or boiled for broth. Offal was eaten fresh or preserved. Blood was mixed with grain to make blood sausage or blood bread. Horn became drinking vessels and tool handles. Even hooves were boiled down for glue. What made these strategies effective was their integration into a comprehensive survival system. The Norse didn't just preserve food, they calculated precisely how much they needed. They developed rationing systems that, while often inadequate, at least attempted to make supplies last. They maintained flexibility. If fish were abundant one year, they stored more fish and less meat. If hunting was poor, they compensated by preserving more dairy products. Social cooperation was perhaps the most crucial survival strategy. While we've discussed the tensions and conflicts that arose in winter, the overall system was cooperative. Wealthier families helped poorer ones, knowing that letting neighbours starve weakened the entire community. Skilled craftspeople taught their skills to apprentices, ensuring knowledge was preserved and distributed. Communities came together for major tasks, repairing storm damage to buildings, helping a household whose stores had been destroyed by fire or pests, collectively managing shared resources like forests and fishing grounds. The Norse also developed psychological and cultural strategies for coping with winter. The ritual calendar provided structure and meaning. The winter solstice, the shortest day, was celebrated with feasts and gift-giving, what would eventually become Yule and then Christmas. This acknowledgement that the days would start growing longer, that winter had passed its worst point, provided hope and a sense of progress. Stories and sagas reinforced cultural values, courage, endurance, loyalty, that supported winter survival. And, Here's an interesting adaptation: the Norse acceptance of a different activity rhythm across the seasons. They didn't expect to maintain summer's productivity year-round. Winter was for maintenance, for craft work, for storytelling and socialising, for rest after the intense labour of the growing season. This acceptance reduced stress and allowed people to adapt their expectations to seasonal reality. Physical adaptations were important too. The Norse developed clothing optimised for cold, layered wool garments that trapped air for insulation, outer layers of leather or wool that blocked wind and shed moisture, mittens rather than gloves to keep fingers together for warmth, fur-lined hats and hoods. They understood that staying dry was crucial, that wet wool lost its insulating properties, that frostbite was prevented by keeping extremities covered and warm. Medical knowledge, while limited by modern standards, did exist. Herbal remedies for common ailments, midwifery practices that improved childbirth outcomes, bone setting for fractures, wound care that prevented some infections. These practices saved lives. The Norse were keen observers of cause and effect, and over generations they accumulated practical medical knowledge that, while not miraculous, was better than nothing. It's hard not to admire the Norse ingenuity in developing these survival strategies. They didn't have the advantages of modern technology or scientific understanding, but they had deep observational knowledge, accumulated wisdom, and a willingness to learn from failure. The families and communities that survived did so because they implemented these strategies effectively, because they cooperated when cooperation was essential, and because they adapted their approaches based on experience. Yet even with all these strategies, winter remained brutal, and when spring finally came, the relief was immeasurable. Let's turn now toward our conclusion, and think about what happened when winter finally released its grip. The end of winter didn't come suddenly. It came gradually, hesitantly, sometimes with false starts where mild weather would arrive only to be followed by renewed cold and snow. But eventually, undeniably, spring asserted itself, and for the Norse who had survived another winter, the emotional relief was profound. Consider the signs of spring's approach. The days grew noticeably longer, the sun climbing higher in the sky, providing actual warmth instead of just pale light. Snow began to melt, first from roofs and south-facing slopes, then more generally as temperatures rose above freezing. The sound of running water returned as streams and rivers thawed, ice breaking up with cracks that echoed across the landscape. And then, miraculously, colour returned to the world. The first green shoots pushing through melting snow, early flowers blooming, birds returning from their southern migrations. Picture the first day warm enough to work outside without immediately freezing. People emerge from their longhouses like prisoners released from confinement, blinking in the bright sunlight, feeling warmth on their faces, breathing fresh air that doesn't reek of smoke and bodies and animals. Children run and play, expending energy they've been forced to contain for months. Adults assess the damage winter has wrought, buildings in need of repair, fences down, the condition of surviving livestock. The work of spring was intense and immediate. Fields had to be prepared for planting, livestock had to be moved to pasture, buildings needed repair, stored food that was spoiling had to be dealt with, the winter dead had to be properly buried. But this work, while exhausting, was infused with hope that winter work had lacked. You were working toward growth and abundance, not just grinding out daily survival. What made spring truly joyous was the return of fresh food. The first greens foraged from the forest and fields. Dandelion leaves, nettles, wild onions, tasted like miracles after months of dried fish and stale grain. The first fresh eggs, the first milk from livestock that had resumed production, the first fish caught from newly thawed waters. These simple foods were celebrations, proof that the world was alive again, that famine had been staved off for another year. Social life resumed in spring. Neighbours visited back and forth. Young people met and courted. Marriages were arranged and celebrated. Trade began again as coastal waters became navigable and paths through the forests became passable. News spread of how other communities had fared, who had died, which farms had been abandoned, where help was needed. And here's the bittersweet aspect. Spring revealed the full cost of winter. Some farms were found with all occupants dead, entire households lost. The scale of death became clear as communities took stock, counting the elderly who hadn't made it, the children who died from disease, the men who'd had accidents or who'd frozen during attempted winter travel. Burial mounds multiplied in the family plots, and the living mourned while simultaneously feeling guilty for having survived. Survivors often bore physical marks of winter, missing fingers or toes from frostbite, lingering coughs from respiratory illness, weakened constitutions that would take months to recover if they ever fully did. Psychologically, they bore scars too, nightmares, anxiety about the next winter already, grief for those lost, sometimes guilt about decisions made and actions taken during the darkest months. But there was also resilience, even joy. The Norse celebrated survival. They held feasts, shared stories of the winter that had passed, honoured those who died, and looked forward to summer with anticipation. The cultural emphasis on endurance, on facing hardship with courage, meant that having survived another brutal winter was an achievement worth celebrating. We can scarcely imagine the emotional journey from winter's depths to spring's light, the transition from survival mode to something approaching normal life, the rediscovery of colour and warmth and growth after months of grey and cold and death. The Norse experienced this cycle every year, and it shaped their understanding of life as cyclical, of hardship as temporary but inevitable, of spring as something that had to be earned through the trial of winter. And with this, dear listener, we approach the end of our long exploration of Viking winters. But we're not quite done yet. Let us gather our thoughts and reflect on what this all means, what these centuries-old winters can teach us, and what it means to have survived, or to remember those who didn't. The outro awaits us, but first perhaps you need a moment to imagine that first warm spring day, to feel the sun on your face and your mind, to remember that winter, however brutal, eventually ends. And so we've journeyed together through the long, dark, brutal months of Viking winter. We've explored the cold and the hunger, the disease and the violence, the psychological toll and the physical suffering. We've seen how ordinary people endured extraordinary hardship, how they adapted and survived despite conditions that would break most modern humans. It's easy, from our comfortable modern perspective, to see the Norse as either noble savages who embraced hardship stoically, or as primitive people who simply didn't know any better. But neither view does them justice. They were people like us, complex, contradictory, capable of both remarkable cooperation and terrible cruelty. They loved their families, feared death, sought comfort and meaning. And they lived in a world that demanded more of them than any world should demand of anyone. The strategies they developed, the architecture, the food preservation, the social cooperation, the psychological resilience, these were hard-won achievements, bought with centuries of trial and error, paid for in countless lives lost. Each longhouse represented generations of refinement. Each preservation technique embodied knowledge learned from failures that meant starvation. Each cultural practice around winter survival was built on the bones of those who hadn't survived to teach what they'd learned. Modern people sometimes romanticize the past, imagine that life was simpler and perhaps better in earlier times. But understanding Viking winter should dispel any such romanticism. Life was not simpler. It was harder in almost every measurable way. The margin between survival and death was measured in inches of snow, in degrees of temperature, in pounds of stored food. Mistakes that modern people recover from easily could be fatal. And there was no safety net, no rescue services, no modern medicine to save you when things went wrong. Yet there's something worth admiring in the Norse response to their brutal environment. They didn't give up. They didn't abandon Scandinavia and move en masse to more hospitable climates, though they certainly explored and sometimes settled elsewhere. They stayed, they adapted, they endured. They built a culture that could withstand winter's assault, that could maintain coherence and meaning despite months of darkness and hardship. But we shouldn't end there, should we? Because there's more to learn, more to reflect upon, about what Viking winters mean for us today, living in our very different world. Let me continue. You might wonder why we've spent these hours exploring such grim subject matter. Why dwell on suffering that happened centuries ago, to people long dead, in a world that no longer exists? What's the point of this extended meditation on brutal winters? Perhaps the answer lies in perspective. Modern life, for those of us fortunate enough to live in developed countries with heating and abundant food and modern medicine, is comfortable in ways the Norse couldn't have imagined. We complain about minor inconveniences, a delayed package, a cold office, food that isn't quite to our taste. And those complaints aren't invalid. Our experiences are our reality. But understanding how humans once lived, how much they endured just to see another spring, can recalibrate our sense of what constitutes genuine hardship. This isn't about minimising modern struggles. Mental health challenges, economic insecurity, social isolation, these are real problems that cause real suffering. But perhaps remembering Viking winters can help us appreciate what we have. The fact that you can be warm whenever you choose, that you have access to food, not just preserved food that's barely edible, but fresh, varied, nutritious food from around the world. That disease, while still a threat, is no longer the constant reaper it once was. That you have privacy, space, the ability to be alone when you need solitude. The Norse would have considered our lives unbelievably luxurious. Even middle-class existence in a developed country would seem like the lifestyle of kings to them. We have more food, more warmth, more comfort, more entertainment, more medical care, more of almost everything than even the wealthiest Viking jarls could access. This isn't about guilt. You didn't choose to be born in this era any more than they chose to be born in theirs. But it might be worth a moment of gratitude. There's also something to learn about resilience from the Norse example. They faced brutal winters year after year, knowing that winter would return, that the cycle of hardship was inescapable. And yet they maintained their culture, their bonds, their sense of meaning. In an age when many people struggle with depression and anxiety despite material comfort, there might be lessons in how humans can endure hardship that seems unending. Not that we should romanticize their suffering or suggest that hardship is good for character development. That's nonsense. The Norse would have gladly traded their brutal winters for our modern comfort. But the fact that they endured, that they found ways to make life meaningful despite the darkness and cold, suggests something profound about human adaptability and resilience. And perhaps there's a warning here too. Our modern comfort depends on systems that are more fragile than we'd like to believe. Supply chains, power grids, global agriculture. Climate change threatens to disrupt these systems. If we're not careful, if we don't make the necessary adaptations, future humans might face their own brutal winters, different in kind but no less challenging than what the Norse endured. Understanding how humans once survived without modern technology might become practical knowledge again rather than just historical curiosity. But we're not quite finished with our reflections, are we? There's one more thread to pull, one more meditation to offer before we let you rest. Bear with me just a little longer. I want to thank you for staying with me through this long, dark exploration. It's not an easy listen, is it? Spending hours hearing about suffering and death and the brutalities of winter past. It takes a certain patience, a certain willingness to engage with uncomfortable truths about human history and human nature. But perhaps that's why you're here. Maybe you find that these explorations, these boring histories, these deep dives into subjects both fascinating and grim help you in some way. Maybe they help you sleep by giving your mind something to focus on other than your own worries. Maybe they provide perspective, as we discussed. Maybe they're just interesting, and that's enough. Whatever brought you to this particular exploration, I hope it's been worthwhile. I hope you've learned something, or been made to think, or simply been kept company through a few hours that might otherwise have felt longer and lonelier. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into Viking winters, there are many more such explorations available. History is full of fascinating, terrible, illuminating stories about how humans have lived and died, struggled and survived. Each episode is another journey into the past, another opportunity to understand the human experience in its vast variety. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, helps more people find these stories, and signals that this kind of long-form, detailed historical exploration is something audiences want. But truly, no pressure. You've given me hours of your time already, and I'm grateful for that regardless. We're almost at the end now, just a little longer, and then you can rest, can let your mind wander or settle into sleep. Whichever you need. Let me offer one final reflection on Viking winters and what they mean, and then we'll conclude our journey together. Picture, one last time, a Norse woman standing outside her longhouse on the first truly warm day of spring. The snow is melting in great sheets, running off in rivulets that sparkle in the sunlight. The air smells of earth and growing things instead of smoke and confinement. Behind her, the longhouse that has been both prison and sanctuary stands still, its turf roof greening as new grass sprouts. Around her, others are emerging, blinking in the light, beginning the work of another season. She survived another winter. Not everyone did. There are fresh graves in the family plot, people she loved who didn't make it to this moment. But she's here. Her children are here. Spring has come, impossible as that seemed during February's darkest days. The world hasn't ended. Life continues. What does she feel in this moment? Relief, certainly. Grief for those lost. Exhaustion from months of stress and inadequate sleep and constant vigilance. But also something like triumph. She endured. Her family endured. They faced winter and survived. And that survival is its own kind of victory against an enemy that never tires, never shows mercy, never deviates from its brutal course. The Norse didn't write much about feelings. Their literature focuses on actions and events rather than introspection. But they must have felt something in these spring moments, these transitions from survival back to living, a lifting of burden, a cautious hope, an awareness of their own strength and fragility, intimately intertwined. We've spent these hours together exploring the darkness, literally and figuratively, of Viking winters. We've looked unflinchingly at the cold, the hunger, the disease, the violence, the death. We've seen how humans adapted, how they endured, and how they sometimes broke under the pressure. We've witnessed suffering that's difficult to imagine, endurance that's difficult to comprehend. But we've also seen resilience, cooperation, ingenuity, love persisting despite brutality, communities holding together despite enormous pressures to fracture, people finding meaning and purpose even when life seemed to offer little of either, the human spirit tested to its limits and beyond, often finding something more, not always, not in everyone, but enough. Enough to survive, enough to continue, enough to face the knowledge that next winter was coming and still choose to live. And that, perhaps, is the final lesson of Viking winters, that humans can endure almost anything if they must, that we adapt, we cooperate, we find ways forward even through the darkest, coldest, most brutal of times, not perfectly, not without cost, not without losses that leave scars on survivors and gaps in communities. But we endure. So as you settle now into rest, as you let this long story fade from active thought into the background, remember that you are the descendant of survivors, countless generations of humans, facing challenges we can barely imagine, somehow made it through. They survived the winters, the famines, the plagues, the violence. They survived long enough to have children, who survived to have children, continuing the chain that reaches down to you. You carry, in your genes, the legacy of endurance, the ability to face difficulty and continue, the capacity to adapt to circumstances beyond your control, the resilience to survive your own winters, whatever form they take. This doesn't make your struggles invalid or easy, but it does mean you're not alone. You're part of a long story of human survival, and that story is ultimately one of hope. Rest now, dear listener. Let your mind settle, your body relax. Winter always comes, but spring always follows. Darkness gives way to light. Hardship, no matter how prolonged, eventually ends. And in the meantime, we endure. We survive. We hold on until the thaw comes, until the days grow longer, until warmth returns. Thank you for journeying with me through these brutal, fascinating, ultimately human stories of Viking winter. May your rest be peaceful, your sleep be deep, and your own springs, literal or metaphorical, arrive right when you need them most. Good night. And remember, this is boring history, which means there are no dramatic cliffhangers, no excitement to keep you wakeful. Only the slow, detailed, careful exploration of how life once was. Let that knowledge settle over you like a heavy blanket, warm and secure. Let it carry you gently into whatever rest you seek. Until next time, dear listener, until the next journey into the past, the next story worth telling slowly and completely, sweet dreams,